Welcome to Audio Novel. If you enjoy my work, don't forget to like and subscribe. To access advanced chapters or support the author, visit their official page, link is in the description. Thank you for being part of this journey. Let's dive into the story. Chapter 101, Fame in One Battle. The more intense a game is, the more thrilling it becomes, the more difficult it is, the more valuable the victory. And because of this, such games often give rise to superstars. This time, it was Lance. Looking back at the game, it's clear that the Crimson Tide faced immense pressure this week, and their victory was far from easy. Lance played a pivotal role. 148 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. The stats were already impressive, though slightly below Lance's season average. However, it was the parts that stats can't capture that made all the difference. Whether it was the powerful run that broke through the impenetrable defense in the third quarter, or the game-sealing run in the fourth quarter, both moments left the audience in awe and showcased Lance's complete skill set. Tough, determined, and smart, while other NCAA teams began adapting to his speed and explosiveness, Lance proved through his actions that his success wasn't just a flash in the pan. If there had been a vote for the game's MVP, Lance would have won it unanimously. Unlike Derrick Henry, Lance was still raw. His limited experience in football was undeniable. But even now, his understanding of the game, his ability to seize opportunities, and his balance between technique and power were already at an elite level. Just imagine, if Lance could play this well without fully grasping football yet, what heights could he reach with more time and experience? The season was halfway over. Since the start, Lance had taken the college football world by storm, but the doubts and debates surrounding him were constant. Some believed his exceptional performances were just a flash in the pan, others thought it was more due to opponents being unfamiliar with him. Some attributed his success to the Crimson Tide's offensive line rather than his own talent. Regardless, Lance was under constant scrutiny. In the case of running backs, the NCAA and the NFL are notoriously strict. In fact, running backs are judged more harshly than quarterbacks, or any other position for that matter. This has become a trend in the sport. Running backs must put on performances 10 to 20 times better than others to prove their worth. On a 100-point scale, other players can score 80 and be considered excellent, while quarterbacks scoring 70 would be praised. But a running back must score 120 just to be deemed good enough. Just look at the Heisman Trophy odds. Despite Lance's stellar performances, he was only ranked 4th. McCaffrey and Fournette weren't even in the top 5, and with Derrick Henry just winning the Heisman last year, this season's standards for running backs were even more stringent. But now, Lance had finally hit that 120-point mark. With his game-changing performance, he had truly proven himself. Fame in one battle. From the season opener, people had realized Lance was a potential superstar. But geniuses are not rare in the world of sports. In fact, talent is just the baseline for entry. To truly convert potential into on-field success, athletes must go through countless trials and tribulations. No one expected that in just under 3 months, Lance would repeatedly deliver awe-inspiring performances, and now, facing one of the toughest defenses in the nation, he had shined brighter than ever, cementing his place as a rising star in the NCAA. While we don't yet know how the professionals in the NCAA and NFL reacted to this, the crowd at Tiger Stadium certainly erupted. After the game, reporters swarmed the players' tunnel. From a distance, Hurts saw the throng of people, and his heart skipped a beat. After such a heated and exhilarating game, it was hard for a young player not to feel excited. With his head held high, Hurts walked forward confidently, and sure enough, the reporters didn't miss him. After all, quarterbacks are always the stars of the team, even if they're just workhorses. The quarterback is always in the spotlight, no matter their performance. But as Hurts began to passionately recount the challenges and difficulties of the game, he noticed something strange. Fewer and fewer microphones were pointed his way. Reporters were slowly drifting away. "Hurts, what's happening?" Following the reporter's gaze, Hurts spotted Lance, laughing and chatting with Humphrey. The reason for the reporter's exodus was clear. Hurts couldn't help but chuckle. It made sense. In the Crimson Tide, running backs would always overshadow the quarterbacks. Besides, Hurts knew he still had a lot of growing to do. Compared to Lance, who was also a rookie, Hurts still had some catching up to do. This game had only highlighted that reality further. Even so, he couldn't help feeling a little disappointed, a bit bitter. But before the feeling could settle in, Hertz saw Humphrey step in front of Lance, blocking the reporters with a straight face. "I know you're all here to interview me. I really appreciate it, but unfortunately, I can't do all the interviews. So how about this, if you want to interview me, you have to interview Lance too. Let's give the rookie a little taste of the spotlight, let him feel what it's like to be under the superstar glow." Ha ha. The entire group burst into laughter. Hertz couldn't hold back and joined in the laughter too. The reporters looked at Lance, who stood obediently in the background, playing the role of a sidekick. Out of respect for Humphrey, who was one of the standout players today, and a defensive star for the Crimson Tide, they agreed. After some more light-hearted exchanges, Humphrey finished the interview, made sure the reporters didn't make things too difficult, and then sauntered over to Hertz, swaying his head and sighing dramatically. "Sigh, it's a young man's world now. Hertz?" He couldn't hold back a smile, and his mood brightened once again. Looking at Lance, Hertz clenched his fists. Lance had earned this attention with his performance, and Hertz would keep working hard to win his own applause. Meanwhile, surrounded by reporters, Lance remained calm and composed as he faced the barrage of microphones. "Lance, it was an incredible game and an incredible win. You seem to have extra motivation today. Was it because of Fournette? Currently, you, Fournette, and McCaffrey are regarded as the 3 top running backs in college football, and you're all in the running for the Heisman Trophy. Was today's game a personal showdown for you? What are your thoughts on Fournette's performance today?" The questions flew in from all directions, with microphones and recorders thrust toward Lance. Lance blinked innocently, his eyes wide with purity. Who? Chapter 102, Participation is what matters. Who? The whole scene fell silent. The reporters could hardly believe what they had just heard. Did Lance really say that? Was Lance trying to stir up the already deep-rooted rivalry between the Crimson Tide and the Tigers even more? Some reporters thought perhaps the noise in the stadium was too loud, and Lance might not have heard the question clearly. One reporter kindly repeated the question, trying to give Lance an out. "Fournette, Leonard Fournette." Lance looked genuinely innocent, as if he had no ill intentions. He truly didn't know who that was. No matter how many times the reporters repeated it, his response would be the same. Not far away, Hertz and Humphrey were doing their best to hold back their laughter. If they hadn't been worried about causing a misunderstanding, they might have burst out laughing right there. They knew Lance wasn't pulling a prank. On the Crimson Tide team, Lance referred to people by their jersey numbers or nicknames. At first, the players thought Lance was messing with them, but Lance had honestly explained that he wasn't good with names and never had been. Over time, everyone realized Lance was being serious, with no intention of singling anyone out. To him, everyone was nameless. At this moment, Hertz, feeling sorry for the soon-to-be infuriated Tigers star, glanced at Humphrey, who was watching the situation like a spectator at a show. Hertz finally couldn't bear it and called out, "The running back." That running back. Lance caught the key detail. "Oh, that running back." The reporters. How did one of the top running backs in the NCAA suddenly become a nameless running back, in Lance's eyes? That running back. It sounded incredibly dismissive. Still looking completely earnest, Lance finally connected the name to the face. "I'm sure he gave it his best today." As a fellow running back, Lance understood that injuries, along with the Crimson Tide's focused defense, could affect Fournette's performance. But from what Lance saw, Fournette had given his all, right up until the fourth quarter, even after repeatedly being stopped, he kept trying. His perseverance was commendable. However, to the reporters, Lance's seemingly encouraging words came off like an adult praising a child, more like a consolation than genuine praise. Was this normal? He gave it his best. Wasn't that just a subtle way of saying Fournette's ceiling wasn't very high? So, was participation all that mattered? The reporters began murmuring, buzzing with excitement as their imaginations ran wild. It wasn't shock, it was excitement. The thrill of having stumbled upon explosive news. They could already picture the headlines for tomorrow's sports pages. In a rivalry game, the drama never disappoints. Just as the tension started to die down, another question was thrown at Lance, aimed at stoking the flames. "Lance, what's your opinion of Jackson and Watson? Do you think they deserve the Heisman Trophy, or do you have other thoughts?" A trap, plain and simple, was laid right in front of Lance, with the reporters sharpening their knives like wolves ready to pounce on Little Red Riding Hood. But Lance remained completely unbothered. "Oh, I think my teammate deserves the Heisman more, number 26. Number 26. Crimson Tide's number 26 was none other than Marlon Humphrey. Whoosh. All the reporters' heads turned to Humphrey, who promptly flexed his biceps like a bodybuilder showing off his muscles, striking a pose. Lance, still looking entirely sincere, continued, "I've always thought it's wrong that the Heisman only looks at offensive players. We should recognize that football is a team sport. Offense, defense, and special teams all play crucial roles, and the NCAA's top players should include those on defense. If I'm not mistaken, the Super Bowl MVP earlier this year was a defensive player. So why can't the Heisman Trophy go to a defensive player?" Mic drop. The reporters. That was not how this was supposed to go. They had tried to provoke tension between Lance and Jackson or Watson, hoping for a juicy confrontation. Instead, Lance had turned the tables on the reporters themselves. The Heisman vote is divided into two main parts: professional journalists and former Heisman winners. The journalists collectively hold 870 votes, and the 57 living former Heisman winners also cast votes every year. In other words, many of the reporters standing in front of Lance would help decide the Heisman winner. And now, Lance was accusing them of ignoring defense and doing a disservice to the game. The reporters were left speechless. They couldn't refute his point. They couldn't argue back. They couldn't even explain themselves. It was a fact that everyone focused on offense, but it was also a fact that defense was equally important. Anyone responding to this would have to tread carefully to avoid stepping on a landmine. A moment earlier, the reporters had tried to dig a hole for Lance. Now, Lance had dug a grave for them all. The atmosphere grew awkward. The reporters exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to face Lance's piercing gaze. No one had expected Lance to flip the script and steer the conversation toward them. But then, just as tension thickened, Lance shifted the topic. "As for the rest, were you asking me to evaluate their rushing ability or their passing ability? If it's about passing, I have no clue. But if it's about rushing," Lance shrugged, "hey, I know a little something about running the ball." The playful smirk and casual tone clearly held a touch of irony, teasing one of the current hot debates in the NCAA and NFL. When it comes to running quarterbacks, are they truly quarterbacks, or are they just running backs? That debate had yet to find a conclusion, and with his clever wordplay, Lance had handed the dilemma right back to the reporters. Without missing a beat, Lance turned to leave. The reporters suddenly panicked. Was the interview already over? Had Lance just dug them a grave and walked away? And they'd only asked a few questions. Frantically, the reporters chased after Lance, crowding around him, before quickly firing off another major question. "Lance, even though this is your first season in the NCAA, we can't help but notice you're already a junior. So, are you planning to declare for the draft next year? Or are you thinking about staying for your senior year?" The draft. Indeed, this had been a blind spot for many. When Lance had burst onto the scene, everyone naturally assumed he would enter the draft. But at the same time, there was talk of his inexperience. His time in football was so short that if he declared for the draft next year, his stock was uncertain, especially as a running back. Now, with the season progressing and Lance's performances speaking for themselves, the question became more pressing. If Lance announced his intention to enter the draft now, teams interested in him would surely come calling, regardless of where he might be projected to be picked. So, how did Lance feel about it? Without hesitation, Lance responded, as if the reporters had asked him what he wanted for dinner rather than about his career. "Oh, that's not something I'm thinking about right now." Wait, what? Chapter 103, Long-Term Planning. Eyes full of excitement and anticipation focused on Lance, with eager gazes almost melting him under their intensity, brimming with curiosity for what he'd say. Yet, despite being surrounded on all sides, Lance remained calm and composed, giving an unexpectedly straightforward answer. "Oh, this isn't something I'm considering right now." "What?" The reporters were briefly stunned, thrown off by his response. Not considering it? What did he mean by that? This brief moment of shock gave Lance the perfect opportunity to slip away, walking off with ease as if passing through an empty space. The reporters, finally snapping out of their daze, hurried after him like a tidal wave crashing down. From a distance, Burns and Sabin saw the scene unfolding. Burns had been preparing to step in and help but saw Lance suddenly pick up the pace, calling Humphrey and Hertz along to escape. Humphrey, following the two, ran while yelling in confusion, "Wait, why am I running? Someone tell me, why am I running?" As he questioned, he continued to run. In no time, the three young players had ditched the reporters, leaving a few out-of-breath journalists struggling to keep up, huffing and puffing as they stood there, gasping for air. Burns chuckled, "Looks like they didn't need help after all." Sabin allowed a small smile, "No, they still need a little help." Burns. Sabin didn't leave him in suspense. "We've just won 9 straight games. There are 3 regular season games left, then the conference championship, a bowl game, and potentially the national championship. The media frenzy is only going to intensify. I'm worried about how these young men will handle the mounting pressure." Burns instantly understood. Just look at last season for context. Last year, the Crimson Tide had entered the season with high expectations as the 3rd seed, but an early loss in the 3rd week took the pressure off early. Meanwhile, Clemson Tigers, seeded 12th, went on an undefeated run, climbing to the number 1 spot, with all of North America's eyes fixed on Deshaun Watson and his team. After a perfect 14-0 season, they headed into the national championship final. The pressure had been entirely on Clemson's shoulders. And everyone knew how that turned out. The Crimson Tide toppled the top seed to claim the championship. This year, the Crimson Tide had switched places with Clemson, with the pressure mounting even further. Since the start of the season, Alabama had kicked off as the top seed and defending champion, but only they knew the full extent of the challenges they faced. With the departure of Derrick Henry and the impact of injuries on their running backs, the team had been under immense pressure to prove themselves. Now, after another series of victories, the cracks were beginning to show, especially in the hard-fought win against Louisiana State. Today, the Crimson Tide managed to maintain their unbeaten record thanks to Lance's outstanding performance, but going forward, the pressure and the challenges would only continue to escalate. The last thing they needed was to fall into the same trap Clemson did last year, dominating the season only to lose the most important game. Given this situation, the last thing they needed was for the media to stir things up even more. Burns looked at Sabin, "What's your plan?" Sabin took a deep breath. "Ban all interviews. Every single one." Burns was stunned. "Nick, you realize this will make us a target for the media?" Sabin nodded. "I know. But that's my decision. If they have any complaints, they can take it up with me. I'll personally speak to the university president." In other words, Sabin was willing to be the bad guy himself. Sabin turned to Burns, "This is the digital age. Taking away the players' phones won't work, they'll definitely still see what's online. But I need your help to make sure they ignore the media. I don't want them paying attention to any news, whether it's praise or criticism." Burton. Just saying his name was enough. After working together for a decade, they understood each other perfectly. Burns raised his hands in mock surrender, smiling. "No problem. You'll be the bad guy, I'll be the enforcer. The kids will fall in line." Sabin didn't mind, his expression cold and resolute, displaying the ruthless decisiveness of a seasoned coach. "Burton, keep a close eye on Lance." Burns furrowed his brow. "You're worried about him?" "Well, he is in the spotlight now. It's our fault for pushing him into the limelight too early." To Burns' surprise, Sabin shook his head. "No, I'm not worried about his composure in front of the media, he's handled himself well. I mean on the field. Lance has likely learned a lot from today's game. If he comes to you for guidance, I want you to spend extra time with him." Burns chuckled. "Of course." Sabin lowered his voice, almost talking to himself, "Maybe we've really unearthed a gem. I don't want our greed or haste to ruin him." Burns heard him. "Nick, do you think he should enter the draft next year?" Sabin didn't answer right away, instead lapsing into deep thought. The draft, that was indeed a significant question because declaring for the draft would mean going pro and stepping into a higher level of competition. Despite what the reporters thought, Lance's response had been entirely sincere. He truly hadn't given it much thought. At least, not yet. The season was only halfway over, and Lance had no point of reference. He didn't know how Derrick Henry had performed last year, as he hadn't paid much attention. He believed his own performance had been impressive enough to meet the expectations of the university president, but the season wasn't over yet, was it? And the more he observed, the more convinced he became that Burns and the university president had some sort of arrangement. Whether their goals were being met remained unclear. Though it had started as a mere transaction when Lance joined the football team, he had come to appreciate Burns' dedication to his development. Even Sabin had shown genuine care. They didn't treat him like a mere tool but had invested in his growth, step by step. If possible, Lance wanted to help Sabin and Burns achieve their goals, too. So, for now, the draft wasn't something Lance needed to think about. Still, the idea of entering the draft, facing elite competition, challenging his limits, and pushing himself intrigued him. Lance was curious to see how far his training in the football system could take him and how many top-tier opponents he could face. Just imagining the sound of helmets colliding, the tactical battles, and the intense matchups got his blood pumping. But there was no rush, no need to rush into anything. Draft and pro considerations would come later. This was something to think about long-term. While Lance was taking things slow and steady. Over in the professional leagues, the winds were already shifting, even quicker than the media. The fact was, once general managers saw the media's growing interest in Lance and the possibility of him declaring for the draft next year, the entire league took notice. If any team waited too long to pay attention, they'd already be several steps behind their competition. Chapter 104, Move with the Wind. Without a doubt, Lance and Derrick Henry are two completely different styles of running backs. Sabin has proven that he can not only coach a power runner like Henry, a battering ram of sorts, but also develop someone like Lance, a quick and intelligent runner who uses his mind to break down defenses. Oh, it's rare to hear you praise a running back like this. Trust me, he deserves it. In him, I see shades of McCoy, and a bit of Peterson. I think this kid is a gem. Though he's already shining, he's still waiting to be fully polished. There's still room for growth. Blah blah blah. Baltimore Ravens head coach John Harbaugh picked up the remote and muted the TV. Holding the phone to his ear, he asked, "Did you hear that commentary? What do you think? Do you agree?" The show was Inside the NFL, a professional football program known for its in-depth content. It not only covered weekly NFL games, reports, injuries, and team rumors, but also had a dedicated segment for NCAA games, ensuring that the league stayed informed about the newest draft prospects. This meant that from the moment players stepped onto the NCAA stage, they were already in the spotlight. And this week's hot topic: Lance. The Chinese-American running back, who had burst onto the scene, quickly became the center of attention, dominating discussions week after week. But to Harbaugh, a lot of the media hype seemed inflated. He wasn't entirely convinced that the league wasn't secretly pushing this narrative to tap into the Chinese market. Harbaugh, however, trusted his scouts' reports and his own judgment more than anything else. Yes and no, came the voice from the other end of the phone, belonging to the Ravens scout, Brandt. Harbaugh's curiosity was piqued. "Oh. You're starting to sound like the media with that kind of vague answer." Brandt chuckled. Of course, Lance's speed, explosiveness, and agility are undeniable talents. Compared to McCoy, I'd say he's closer to a Peterson-type mold. But in my opinion, what makes Lance truly exceptional is his brain, his learning ability, and his analytical skills. Harbaugh raised an eyebrow. "Oh. Care to elaborate?" While Brandt was breaking things down for Harbaugh, across the country, Carolina Panthers head coach Ron Rivera was also reviewing footage of Lance. If Rivera had heard Brandt's assessment, it might have been a eureka moment for him. For one, the rapid development and progress Lance had made in just 6 months were beyond belief. It was hard to imagine that someone who had never touched a football before was now playing at such a high level, a testament to Lance's learning ability. Secondly, while Rivera could clearly see Lance's physical gifts, speed, explosiveness, agility, he also knew that there was more to Lance's game than just athleticism. Especially in his recent game against Louisiana State University, Rivera believed that mere physical talent alone wouldn't have been enough to solve the problems Lance faced on the field. There was more to analyze, more layers to his performance. Rivera was both excited and eager, itching to fly to Alabama himself to personally scout Lance. The more he thought about it, the more he believed that Lance could be the perfect running back for the Panthers, an ideal complement to Cam Newton. But logic prevailed, reining him back in. After all, the NFL regular season was still in full swing, and they had games to prepare for. To be honest, Rivera should have been reviewing game footage and working on strategies, not obsessing over a college prospect. But he just couldn't help himself. Rivera thought to himself that his general manager, Dave Gettleman, couldn't possibly turn down a player like Lance, especially one who was Chinese American and had the potential to open up the entire Asian market. Just the thought of it got Rivera's blood pumping again. Some things, he realized, needed to be seen with his own eyes. Sitting up straight, he pressed the intercom. "I need the footage from this week's Alabama Crimson Tide and LSU Tigers game. Immediately. Now." The scene shifts back to Brandt and Harbaugh's conversation. Harbaugh was intrigued. "Dissect. That's an interesting choice of words." Brandt nodded. "Exactly. Like a surgical scalpel, precise and sharp. Right now, everyone is talking about Lance's physical abilities, his speed, explosiveness, agility, etc., and they all know he's a different style of runner than Henry. But they're missing the key point." Harbaugh caught on. "His brain." Brandt confirmed, "Exactly, his brain." This was the puzzle piece that Rivera had yet to fully grasp, though he might get closer to the answer after reviewing the game footage. When we talk about quarterbacks, nobody forgets to mention their brain, their ability to organize, read defenses, and make decisions. But when we discuss running backs, we often overlook that aspect. And Lance is a running back who knows how to use his brain. Though he's still raw and lacks experience, and his style is still evolving, before every snap, he reads the defense and engages in a mental chess match, just like a quarterback. That's what makes him dangerous. This, Brandt explained, was Lance's analytical ability. Harbaugh was impressed. "Are you suggesting Sanders?" When most people think of running backs, the first thing that comes to mind is physicality, power, brute strength, collisions, which is why running backs often get labeled as muscle-bound or even mindless. But that's far from the truth. Many running backs know how to read defenses, adapt, and use their intellect on the field. Barry Sanders, for instance, was one of the best. The legendary Detroit Lions running back, who combined brains, physicality, and speed, played for only 10 years but was widely regarded as the greatest running back in NFL history. He shattered preconceived notions about what a running back could be. In modern football, a running back who relies solely on physicality won't last long. Physical talent sets the floor, but intelligence sets the ceiling. Somewhere, Fournette sneezed, "Is someone bad-mouthing me?" As Harbaugh processed Brandt's description, the image of Barry Sanders immediately came to mind. Sanders was a god among men. But before Harbaugh could get too carried away, Brandt brought him back to reality. Not quite. Lance's physical toughness still needs work. He's nowhere near the level of Sanders, not even freshman-year Sanders. But, Brandt added, let's not forget, Lance has only been playing football for 6 months. There was no need to say more. Harbaugh got it. Lance was already impressive now, but his potential for growth was what really made him exciting. Perhaps one day, he could indeed become a player as legendary as Sanders. Harbaugh exhaled deeply. Well, this could be a problem. Lance was too talented, too coveted, and that could be an issue. Brandt immediately picked up on Harbaugh's concern. I used to think running backs weren't in high demand. But now, it seems every team in the league is looking for one. Still, there aren't many teams willing to use a top 3-round pick on a running back. Coach, do you know who I saw at the LSU game? For once, Brandt decided to tease a bit. Harbaugh paused. Jacksonville. Brandt burst out laughing. Cleveland. Harbaugh, damn. Chapter 105, Determined to Win. Unlike other sports, football has many positions on the field, making draft strategies more complex. In simple terms, teams generally follow 2 strategies. First, pick what the team urgently needs. Even if the best player in the draft is a quarterback, if a team already has a reliable franchise quarterback, they won't pick another quarterback, no matter how talented the rookie may be. Teams should match their draft picks to their own needs and select the best available player for that position, or fill gaps in their roster. The saying goes, one man's trash is another man's treasure. A draft should not follow the hype. Just because a player is trending doesn't mean they are the best fit for every team. Popular players might be superstars or busts, depending on the team's needs, so staying calm and clear-headed is key. Second, pick the best player available. Sometimes the player a team urgently needs has already been taken by another team. In such cases, selecting the best available player left on the board can be a good backup plan. The team can either trade the player for greater value or keep them and adjust their roster, filling other needs through free agency to build a balanced lineup. This approach can be tricky, though, because it requires understanding the market value of draft picks, the team's salary cap, and future contract negotiations. A single misstep can create redundancies in the roster. Before the draft, every NFL team runs mock drafts to prepare for various scenarios, not just their second or third option, but sometimes up to their sixth or seventh. Yet, despite all the preparation, the actual draft often surprises, making it unpredictable. This is why the NFL draft is always so exciting, like a roller coaster with unexpected twists and turns, full of surprises. Top prospects unexpectedly falling out of the first round, popular players going undrafted, teams selecting kickers in the first 3 rounds, or teams finding hidden gems in the 6th or 7th rounds, anything can happen. Until the last pick is made, no one knows for sure how things will unfold. In fact, even sometimes the general managers and head coaches don't fully understand how things turned out. In this chaotic backdrop, the NFL has a few teams that consistently disrupt the usual draft strategies. With sudden picks and surprise trades, they throw everyone's plans into disarray, setting off domino effects that leave other teams scrambling. These teams thrive on unpredictability. For example, the New York Jets. Other teams like the Jacksonville Jaguars, Cleveland Browns, and Washington Football Team also often deliver shocking moments with their bold draft moves. So, when Scout Brandt kept Harbaugh guessing about which team he saw at the game, Harbaugh immediately thought of the Jaguars. The reasoning was simple: Jaguars head coach Gus Bradley had long lacked influence in the team's decision-making process. Despite his desire to add a running back to ease the pressure on their passing game, general manager David Caldwell had other ideas. Caldwell believed running backs didn't offer enough value and preferred to draft tight ends or wide receivers, leaving the running back position to be filled in free agency. But Lance was different. Lance represented not just an on-field talent but also the opportunity to tap into the vast Chinese and Asian markets. Caldwell, being the shrewd businessman he was, would not miss such an opportunity. Moreover, the NFL would love to see this unfold, quietly pushing the narrative forward, with shows like Inside the NFL dedicating time to discuss Lance. The winds were changing. Harbaugh, ever perceptive, understood Caldwell's motivation perfectly. In fact, Caldwell had already made his decision clear to Bradley. Lance, Caldwell said, his eyes gleaming, not with the cunning of a fox but with the sharpness of a businessman, as he made his final decision. Bradley was quietly thrilled. To be honest, Bradley fully supported Caldwell's decision. If they could draft Lance, Bradley would be more than happy to applaud Caldwell's choice. But why the rush? The regular season was only halfway through, and there were still 6 months until the draft. Was there really a need to jump to conclusions so quickly? Bradley hesitated, saying, of course, Lance would be a perfect pick, but maybe we should still take a look at other running backs, like Fournette or McCaffrey. Caldwell shook his head gently. No, you misunderstood. I'm talking about Lance, not just the position of running back. Bradley. Caldwell clarified, we need Lance. It's just a bonus that he happens to be a running back, that's all. Did you know that in the latest Heisman Trophy odds, Lance has officially surpassed Mayfield and Watson, now second only to Jackson? There are still 3 weeks left in the NCAA regular season. While Jackson has been outstanding, even dominant, his team's performance doesn't compare to that of the Crimson Tide. If the Crimson Tide make it to the national championship but Louisville doesn't, there's a real possibility that Lance could overtake Jackson and win the Heisman. Hey, Gus, if Lance wins the Heisman, he wouldn't just be the first Chinese-American winner, he'd be the first Asian winner in history. Do you know what that means? Caldwell's gaze drifted toward the world map, his eyes settling on the vast land of China. 14 years ago, an NBA team had already taken the first leap into the Chinese market, reaping unbelievable commercial success. Now, it was the NFL's turn. Caldwell wasn't going to let this opportunity slip by. If the Jaguars wanted to seize this moment, they had to move quickly and plan carefully. The NFL and NCAA have strict rules that prevent teams or agents from making personal contact with players before the draft. But they don't ban scouts from attending games. Imagine this: at every game, from training to matches, a row of scouts wearing Jacksonville Jaguars gear would sit front and center. The Crimson Tide would notice. The media would notice. And naturally, Lance would notice. People would start wondering what the Jaguars were planning. But there was no need to rush. They would gradually build the hype, keep the suspense going, and let everyone know the Jaguars had their eyes on a Crimson Tide star without revealing exactly who their target was. Then, when the time was right, Caldwell himself would make the big reveal, heaping praise on Lance. Imagine how Lance would feel then. Sincerity didn't require face-to-face meetings. Even if the NFL and NCAA rules prohibited direct contact, Caldwell could still make a big show of things. The louder and flashier the attention, the more it would signal the Jaguars' determination. Caldwell's gaze was full of ambition. Chapter 106, Pure Nonsense. If the competition for Lance comes from the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Baltimore Ravens can handle it. Harbaugh has his own considerations. Should the Ravens draft a running back, or should they continue to strengthen their defense as they have in recent years? Since winning the Super Bowl in the 2012 season, Harbaugh has been working to fill the void left by Ray Lewis' retirement, rebuilding the Ravens' traditional defensive powerhouse. Meanwhile, the offensive unit, led by Flacco, has been patched up for the past 3 years. In the last 3 seasons, the Ravens have missed the playoffs twice with 8-8 records and made it to the playoffs in 2014, only to be eliminated by the New England Patriots in the second round. So, is it finally time to bolster the offense? If the answer is yes, how much is Harbaugh willing to spend to secure a running back? If their competition is the Jacksonville Jaguars, things should be simpler. However, Harbaugh blinked in disbelief. Who? Brandt repeated, Cleveland. Harbaugh, damn. Someone explain why the Cleveland Browns are suddenly getting involved. Harbaugh took a deep breath and, unable to contain himself, burst out laughing. Do they even need a running back? Brandt shrugged. Do they have any position they don't need players for? Harbaugh couldn't argue with that. Shouldn't they be focusing on picking a quarterback? Watson maybe. They should really be looking at Watson. Brandt replied, Coach, next year is the big quarterback draft. Jackson, Mayfield, they're all expected to declare next year. Maybe the year after, too. They both understood the reasoning. Clearly, the Browns had their own convoluted plans, even if they were a mess. But when it comes down to it, Harbaugh just found it funny. He couldn't understand the thought process of the Browns management. Do they not need a group MRI to check their brains? After a moment of stunned silence, Harbaugh sighed. Since when did running backs become so sought after? Harbaugh's comment was meant as a joke, but Brandt answered seriously. Coach, this isn't just about any running back. He's a Chinese-American running back. Harbaugh was taken aback, then a grin spread across his face. And a damn good one at that. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. All right, I get it. They needed a full game plan and time to consider everything. Drafting wasn't a simple matter, but that's part of the beauty of football. Just as Harbaugh was about to hang up the phone, Brandt's voice came through again. Coach. Harbaugh paused. Brandt hesitated for a moment but still spoke up. Just a personal opinion, but we shouldn't miss out on Lance. I think he's just scratching the surface of his potential. Harbaugh blinked, unable to respond before Brandt hung up. Staring at his phone, Harbaugh fell into thought. He knew Brandt well. Brandt was highly professional and objective, always offering advice from a purely analytical standpoint and never getting personally involved in recommending or influencing decisions. Harbaugh had once been curious. Most scouts wanted their opinions to be heard, respected, and acted upon, but Brandt didn't seem to care. Even now, Harbaugh remembered Brandt's answer. Do you know how many kids I see every day? From middle school to college, sometimes even younger. They all step onto the field with different goals and dreams, and I genuinely hope their talents can shine on a bigger stage. But we all know it's not that simple. In the spotlight, we see victories, championships, and glory. But outside the spotlight, I see injuries, struggles, and frustration, things that never make the headlines. These kids are vivid and real to me. I know their parents. I know their likes and dislikes. I know how they are in school and on the streets. But once they enter the league, they become just a statistic, a persona, like characters in a game. Soulless. They can disappear at any moment. They can be sacrificed or traded at any time. That's not a dream. That's a business. So, I keep my distance, trying not to let my emotions get involved. I treat them as evaluation subjects, not as living souls. It's easier that way. I've seen too many broken dreams and wrecked careers. I don't need to go through it over and over again to be reminded of the harshness of competitive sports. That was how Brant maintained his professionalism. And yet, Brant loved the sport and the people who played it, pouring their heart and soul into the game. With his qualifications and experience, Brant could have easily held a mid-level leadership position in any team, sitting in an office without the need to travel constantly and live out of hotels. Even the Baltimore Ravens offered him a management role, but Brant declined. He loved being on the road. He loved being in the stands. He loved watching the game up close. Like Icarus, he knew the consequences of flying too close to the sun, yet he couldn't resist the temptation to edge closer and embrace it. Today was no different. Brant couldn't help but express his personal opinion about Lance because he admired him. Even though he hadn't said much, that single comment weighed heavily on Harbaugh, more significant than any scouting report. Standing there, Harbaugh was lost in thought. What made this Lance so special? Wasn't he just another running back? And seriously, what was Cleveland up to? The Cleveland Browns, a team notorious for tanking, failing miserably by design, had a formidable record. With poor management and ridiculous rebuilding strategies, they were so adept at losing that they made even their rivals admire their mastery of failure. Since the NFL merger in 1966, marking the beginning of the Super Bowl era, only 4 teams had never won a Super Bowl: the Detroit Lions, Houston Texans, Jacksonville Jaguars, and the Cleveland Browns. And looking at the current situation, the Browns' dream of winning a Super Bowl seemed even further out of reach. Since 1999, the Browns have had only 2 winning seasons, in 2002 and 2007. They made the playoffs only once, in 2002. In fact, forget about the playoffs, just winning a few games was a challenge. The Browns were perennial favorites to finish at the bottom of the standings. They were the worst of the worst, the epitome of a bottom feeder in the NFL. And this season was no different. After losing to the Dallas Cowboys last week, the Browns remained the only team in the league without a single win. 9 straight losses. If you count the 3 losses at the end of last season, that's 12 consecutive defeats. Their bleak situation seemed never-ending. Even fans from other teams couldn't bring themselves to rub salt in the wounds of Browns supporters. Currently, the Cleveland Browns sit dead last among the NFL's 32 teams, far ahead in the race for next year's #1 overall draft pick. Teams like the Chicago Bears and Jacksonville Jaguars can only trail behind, eating their dust. So, here's the question. What should the Cleveland Browns do with their #1 pick? Could it really be Lance? Chapter 107, Professional Disruption. Quarterback, of course. The quarterback is the foundation of building a football team. That's true, but my question is, are we going to tear everything down and rebuild again? We just did that 2 years ago, and now we're going to do it again. Are we really going to start over with a new quarterback? Then what was the point of all our moves in free agency during the off-season? Jesus Christ, you know perfectly well that all those quarterbacks on the team right now are just temporary. We need our own franchise quarterback. And who says one of them can't be our franchise quarterback? Drew Brees was a cast-off from the San Diego Chargers before he became the savior of the New Orleans Saints. I think we should give Griffin another chance. Give Griffin another chance? Easy for you to say, as if we haven't already. So, if we don't draft a quarterback, what do you suggest? A wide receiver? I don't know, maybe an offensive lineman. Our quarterbacks need a solid pocket. Or perhaps a cornerback. Cornerback? Are you out of your mind? Nobody drafts a cornerback in the top 3 rounds. Sashi Brown, vice president and general manager of the Cleveland Browns, sat quietly at the center of the chaos in his office. He knew exactly what kind of mess the team was in. Earlier this offseason, the Cleveland Browns became the laughingstock of the league for the 1,000th time, this time over their quarterback situation. 2 years ago, during the draft, the quarterback pool was slim. There weren't many standout prospects, but Texas A&M's quarterback Johnny Manziel stood out as a singular talent. Many experts believed he had top 3 potential, if not the chance to go first overall. After all, Manziel was the first freshman in NCAA history to win the Heisman Trophy. A quarterback like him was sure to be a hot commodity. However, as the draft unfolded, to everyone's shock, Manziel's name wasn't called early. Teams in need of a quarterback seemed to be avoiding him as if he were cursed. Rumors, gossip, and speculation swirled around as Manziel's stock plummeted. Under the intense spotlight, Manziel's draft position kept falling until the 22nd pick in the first round, where the Cleveland Browns, who had traded for that slot, finally called his name. The agonizing wait was over. When Manziel stepped on stage, he made his signature touchdown celebration gesture, rubbing his fingers together, as if counting money. Manziel explained that every touchdown he scored would increase his value. At the draft, it came off as a taunt toward the teams that passed on him. The public thought, the drama's about to start. Including Sashi Brown, nearly everyone believed Manziel would be the savior of the Cleveland Browns, leading them out of the doldrums. But how did reality play out? Manziel struggled badly in the NFL. Unlike in college, the complex playbooks and tactical nuances of the NFL became Manziel's downfall. He couldn't remember the plays, let alone command the offense. This led to the infamous gif of Manziel banging a playbook against his head in frustration, angry and hopeless, yet utterly helpless. Teams that passed on Manziel at the draft collectively sighed with relief, dodged a bullet. 2 seasons passed quickly, and Manziel didn't become the savior the Browns had hoped for. This offseason, he was cut, losing his job. Despite his attempts to land with another team, spending the entire summer on tryouts, he found no takers. In a twist of irony, Manziel finally signed with a team in the Canadian Football League, where the level of competition and complexity of tactics are somewhat lower. Yet even there, he couldn't find success. The intricate playbooks haunted him like a nightmare. Manziel became a classic example that football is not just about physical prowess, it's a mental game as well. The Browns thought Manziel was their future, but it turned into a joke, wasting 2 seasons of effort. After parting ways with him this offseason, the Browns turned to the free agency market instead of the draft to find their next quarterback. Robert Griffin III, plagued by injuries and discarded by the Washington Redskins, found a new home in Cleveland. Journeyman Josh McCown, who had played for 10 different teams over 15 seasons, also landed in Cleveland, hoping for a fresh start. Additionally, undrafted rookie Kevin Hogan from the previous year and third-round rookie Cody Kessler from this year joined the Browns' quarterback room. These 4 quarterbacks, hastily patched together, formed the Browns' signal caller lineup for the new season. And the result? A 9-game losing streak, with no end in sight. So while other teams fought tooth and nail for playoff spots, the Cleveland Browns were far ahead in preparing their draft strategy. Leading the race. Quarterback. Sure, they were the cornerstone of any team, but the Browns had tried drafting quarterbacks multiple times over the past 15 years, with each attempt ending in failure. They had just rid themselves of the Manziel fiasco this offseason. Were they really ready to gamble on a quarterback in another weak draft class? Defense. That made sense too. Compared to offensive players, defensive players tend to come at better value, and bolstering the defense could help the Browns stabilize quickly. After all, they had no real identity, and both offense and defense were dreadful. Rebuilding the defense first wouldn't be a bad choice. Plus, this year's draft class was known for having a wealth of defensive talent. However, Sashi Brown had a bolder idea. What if we stirred things up a bit? All eyes turned to Brown. "Sashi, what do you mean?" someone asked. Brown shrugged. "You're all right. We need to rebuild, there are holes everywhere. You make valid points, but we can't please everyone. So why don't we take a step back, change our strategy, and create some buzz? Shake things up completely. Get the fans excited about our presence again." It doesn't matter how the team performs, at least we can get the market buzzing again. Give the fans hope, even if it's false hope. Whoever is the most talked about, the most popular player, that's who we'll draft. The room remained puzzled. No one could quite grasp where Brown was headed. But someone finally asked the obvious, so, what exactly are you proposing? Brown smiled and said just one name, Lance. Who said there were only 2 draft strategies? The Cleveland Browns, in their unique way, had found a third strategy. Disruption. Complete, total, and unapologetic chaos. A move that would shock the entire league and throw everything into disarray. Chapter 108, Extra Tutoring. Another training session had just ended, but the players of the Crimson Tide didn't leave right away. Instead, they gathered together in a lively discussion, their faces red with passion, seemingly on the verge of rolling up their sleeves to settle things physically. Upon closer listening, the truth became clear. They weren't about to start a brawl, they were standing up for Lance. This season, Lance's stellar performance had been undeniable. As a dark horse that burst onto the scene, he dominated the Crimson Tide's ground game, standing toe-to-toe with last year's star, Derrick Henry. However, because a running back had just won the Heisman Trophy last year, this season the scrutiny on running backs was unusually harsh. Even now, Lance's odds of winning the Heisman still trailed behind Jackson, putting him in second place. The players of the Crimson Tide were enraged, one after the other fuming with righteous indignation. Let's settle this with a game. Humphrey was the first to throw down the gauntlet. We'll play Louisville. Lance against Jackson, head-to-head, so those so-called experts will have to shut up once and for all. I'll give that Jackson guy a warm welcome, introduce him to the defensive techniques our Crimson Tide has been perfecting for over a century. It'll be an unforgettable experience, body and soul. Roll. Laughter erupted around them. Then, Humphrey noticed Lance, jersey number 23, slowly walking away. He called out, "Lance, what do you think? Want to go for it?" Humphrey had intended to ask Lance if he wanted a direct showdown with Jackson. To his surprise, Lance paused, blinked a few times, and lazily began rolling up his sleeves. He looked at Humphrey with sleepy eyes, gloves on or off. Humphrey's muscles tensed, his grin freezing on his face as he quickly waved his hands. No, wait. Let me explain. But the other guys, always up for some chaos, began chanting, "Humphrey! Humphrey! Humphrey!" Humphrey's face turned pale, and he shot desperate glances at his teammates. Had they forgotten that Lance used to train in mixed martial arts? "Lance, we were just discussing the Heisman Trophy. What are your thoughts on it?" The teammates who had been teasing Humphrey now pushed each other, smirking, but none dared to make eye contact with Lance. Even though Humphrey had backed down, his gaze challenged anyone brave enough to step up in his place. No one did. Lance was a beast, a true alpha. In the daily training routines, players were divided into groups and rotated through different drills. Sometimes, internal competitions were held to see who could do more, who could last longer, and who could perform better. Over the past 3 months, Lance had tried every drill, competing in each one, and some he'd done repeatedly. Despite his always sleepy demeanor, once Lance was locked into training, he transformed completely. It wasn't that Lance won every time, after all, everyone had their strengths and weaknesses, and different drills required different skills. Lance, while incredibly capable, wasn't a master of all trades, at least, not yet. But what set Lance apart was his fierce determination. He always pushed just a little harder. Every time a training session ended, it didn't matter whether he won or lost. His opponents always felt spent, either getting crushed by Lance or forced to their limits. Just look at the defensive line guys. Though strength and power had always been Lance's weak spots, after a practice run of head-on drills with the defensive line, even though Lance himself was battered and bruised, those giant linemen were left lying on the ground, staring into space like 200-pound babies. A beast. One glance from Lance was enough to quiet the banter around them. Lance seemed oblivious to their exchange of glances. No thoughts. Humphrey didn't believe him. What do you mean, no thoughts? Lance glanced at Humphrey again, and Humphrey immediately backed off with a nervous smile. Lance, slightly disappointed, unrolled his sleeves and said, "I mean, I have no thoughts. It's just betting odds, not the actual voting." The most interesting thing about sports is defying the odds, turning the impossible into possible, and driving everyone crazy in the process. Humphrey blinked, feeling like Lance's statement became stranger the longer he listened. Was it just him? Without stopping, Lance continued walking toward the locker room, casually tossing a final remark over his shoulder. Instead of wasting time reading supermarket tabloids, maybe you should hit the library. Are you sure you're ready for final exams, my dear university students? 1 second, 2 seconds. A collective groan echoed. Don't bring that up. One key feature of the NCAA is that academics can't be neglected. First, outside of training, student-athletes are required to attend regular classes with a minimum attendance requirement. To ensure there's no conflict between training and academics, every university schedules specific study sessions for players. They must attend, no exceptions. Second, there's a minimum GPA requirement of 2.0, basically, a passing grade in every class. For some players, that's no easy task. With the end of the NCAA regular season approaching, and finals looming before Christmas, players were now forced to remember their roles as students. Compared to training, this was the real nightmare. Lance had just hit them where it hurt the most. Of course, not all players struggled academically, but that didn't mean they were thrilled about sitting in a library to study. It was a brutal scene. Before Lance could walk away, he spotted a few figures hiding awkwardly behind the stands like groundhogs. Did they not realize the stands were hollow and see-through? And really, how could these big guys even try to squeeze in there? Lance sighed inwardly. After the game against LSU, Lance had noticed the progress bar on his training system had nearly reached 100%. Sure enough, today's practice had filled the bar completely, granting him another chance to flip for a reward. He was eager to see what he might get. So, should he humor the group of groundhogs by pretending not to see them and just move on? Or should he check out his reward first? You go. No, you go. I don't know him well enough. Lance could hear their anxious whispers. Clearing his throat, he made it obvious they'd been found out. Thump. Someone was pushed out from behind the stands. It was Howard. The tight end, a dreadlocked giant, stood there awkwardly in front of Lance, like a kid who needed to use the bathroom but was too shy to ask. OJ, Lance greeted him with a smile. Howard's nickname was one of the few Lance could remember. Everyone called him OJ, short for orange juice. No one even remembered his full name anymore. Taking a deep breath, Howard shut his eyes as if bracing for the worst. In a booming voice, he blurted out, "Please, help us with tutoring." "Thank you. Anne, sorry." Chapter 109, Academic Struggles. Howard was a bit nervous, just a tiny bit. His eyes were tightly shut, his face scrunched up like a helpless victim, as if the simple sentence he had just spoken had drained him of all his strength. Lance said, "Okay." Instinctively, Howard's shoulders tensed up, feeling small and vulnerable. He vividly recalled the terror of being dominated by Lance during the 30-yard shuttle runs. As a tight end, Howard prided himself on his burst speed and strength, so it was no surprise when Lance beat him in the 50-yard shuttle. But with the 30-yard sprint, Howard thought he might actually stand a chance. Yet, he lost. 15 times. The most humiliating moment was when Lance actually lapped him. Lapped. How was that even possible? Howard had all but collapsed in defeat. From that day forward, he made a point to avoid Lance whenever possible. But now, Howard needed Lance's help. Without it, this semester's finals, well, let's just say disaster was imminent. Howard knew he was walking into the lion's den. After being crushed physically, he was about to experience the mental equivalent. Just the thought of it made him shudder. But summoning his courage, he stood in front of Lance, so nervous that he didn't even hear the response. "What?" Howard squinted, his eyes open, his face twitching as if struggling to function properly. Lance had to suppress a chuckle. "Why do you need my help?" Howard froze for a second. "I just want to play football." The sentence felt oddly familiar. Lance couldn't hold it in any longer, bursting into laughter. Ha ha ha. Lance had been wondering why Howard, who hadn't had any academic issues in the past 2 years, suddenly needed extra help. The completely nonsensical response made the whole situation even funnier. Howard was confused, staring blankly at Lance. But laughter was a good sign, right? Howard hurriedly waved to the others. Come on, Lance agreed. In an instant, 5 more groundhogs jumped out from their hiding spots. Even though Lance had been mentally prepared, the sheer number of them still caught him by surprise. Then he spotted Jacobs, trying desperately to blend in with the crowd, clearly embarrassed. Jacobs, normally reserved, looked unusually awkward, his face showing hints of discomfort. Looking closer, Lance realized that among the group, Jacobs, Hertz, and others, they were all freshmen. The reason for this sudden plea for help was obvious. Transitioning from high school to college opened up a whole new world for them. They'd thought that assignments and exams were things of the past, only to find them waiting right around the corner. Completely unprepared, these freshmen were now in full panic mode. Lance turned to Howard. What's a junior doing in the middle of a bunch of freshmen? Hee hee. Howard chuckled awkwardly, learning has no age limit, right? Lance narrowed his eyes at Howard's smile and suddenly had a thought. Wait, don't tell me you guys are asking me for help with math because of some stereotype, are you? Instantly, everyone froze. Howard shivered. No, but his voice caught in his throat, barely making it out. Everyone exchanged awkward glances. Finally, Jacob stepped forward. You sure you're not the one trapped by stereotypes, assuming we'd ask for math help? His response was a bit of a tongue twister, leaving Howard dizzy and confused. Lance looked at Jacobs, not offended at all. He simply raised his chin. So, it's not math. Jacobs hesitated, lowering his gaze and muttering, not entirely. Lance raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised but feigning ignorance. Sorry, what did you say? Jacobs glanced up quickly. Not entirely, he repeated, then immediately looked away as if his neck had stiffened. At that moment, Howard seemed to snap out of his confusion. Lance, it's not just math. I mean, it's not all math. A small part of it does involve math, but there's also economics, British literature, statistics. As Howard continued listing subjects, Lance's jaw nearly dropped. Hold on. You guys do realize I'm not a search engine or an academic website, right? Just then, a few more players who had been lurking near the locker room rushed over. It was Alan, Foster, and a couple of others, all beaming with hope as they looked at Howard. So, did Lance agree? Lance, you're a lifesaver. The scene turned chaotic. Raising his right hand like a conductor silencing an orchestra, Lance gestured for them to pause. Instantly, the noise stopped, and all eyes were on him. Lance said, Guys, I'm just a student, like you. And we're in different majors, this isn't high school. Alan opened his mouth, looking perplexed as he turned to Howard. Didn't you explain it properly? Howard was equally confused. Did he not? Alan rubbed his temples in frustration. Foster, more composed, spoke up. We know that. But your coursework seems so light, and besides being smart, you must have some study techniques. We just need some tips. My economics class requires me to read 10 papers and then write a short one myself. I don't have time to read 10 papers right now. Ah, so that's what it was. Lance exhaled deeply. Of course, no problem. There are definitely techniques for reading papers. Once you grasp a few key points, you can speed read a paper in 5 to 10 minutes. You might not fully understand it, but at least you'll know the main arguments. Foster nodded appreciatively. That's exactly what we need. Alan wiped his forehead dramatically, even though there was no sweat. Thank goodness. Lance, we really need someone with a brain. Lance laughed. What about the one on your neck? Alan looked up as if realizing for the first time. Oh, this doesn't work too well. His honesty made everyone burst into laughter. Alan turned back to Lance. We just need some pointers, some techniques, you know. That way, we can get through finals quicker and have more time to train. Roll. 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 Lance considered it seriously. True. I could use some training partners. Alan, buddy, I think you misunderstood. I wasn't talking about training with you. Should I clear this up? But before Alan could explain, Lance had already moved on. Alan, dude. Scanning the group, Lance figured they'd be spending some quality time in the library today. So, Lance quickly outlined the plan. They'd return to the dorms, grab their study materials, jackets, and maybe some snacks. They'd meet at the library entrance after dinner. Alan, dude. But as the group dispersed, Alan quickly followed, eager to avoid being left alone with Lance. He had no desire to end up in the gym lifting weights with him. Finally, the commotion around Lance quieted down. It seemed there would be no time to relax tonight. Summoning the training system in his mind, Lance eagerly activated the reward he had just earned. A recovery boost card, 5x. The third type of card had appeared. Chapter 110, An Opportunity for Dialogue. Everyone knows that the biggest obstacle in competitive sports is injury. But injuries shouldn't only be treated when they happen, they must be prevented and managed consistently. After every game, players undergo recovery training and treatment. This includes, but is not limited to, light cycling to relax muscles, ice baths, massages, and more. Just like pre-game warm-ups are necessary to activate the muscles, post-game cooldowns are equally important to prevent inflammation and future injuries. It's no exaggeration to say that post-game recovery is as crucial as pre-game warm-ups. The recovery boost card Lance had just drawn played exactly that role. Initially, Lance thought it was meant for injury recovery, but after carefully reading the description, he realized it enhanced recovery after every training session and game, improving the results of his post-game recovery training. In simple terms, it's like a card that boosts injury prevention. A pleasant little surprise. Although he didn't draw a player template card, which was a bit disappointing, Lance was actually more satisfied with the recovery boost card. First, it answered a lingering question. There is a third type of card that brings entirely new features. Second, this card was exactly what Lance needed at the moment. Its importance was no less than the injury risk reduction card. With the season nearing its end, both physically and mentally, Lance was being tested to the limit. As someone new to football, he was keenly feeling the pressure. The intensity, tension, strain, and stress were beyond anything he'd ever experienced, not even in mixed martial arts or cross-country running. The concept of physical endurance was becoming increasingly clear. Especially after the game against LSU, Lance felt a level of exhaustion he had never experienced before. It's no wonder that as seasons progress, injuries become more frequent in sports like football and basketball, and with the aggressive nature of football, it's even worse. At this crucial point in the season, drawing the recovery boost card felt like perfect timing. It directly addressed a key concern for Lance. And it was a 5-fold boost. Even without a direct comparison, based on the other two enhancement cards, it was clear that this card was of immense value. Without hesitation, Lance equipped the card immediately. With that, all 3 card slots were filled. But it sparked even more curiosity: can the slots be expanded? If not, will he have to make tough decisions in the future? And if there's a third type of enhancement card, could there be a fourth or fifth? Excited by the new possibilities, Lance felt a renewed sense of motivation for the upcoming training sessions and games. His steps grew lighter, and soon he noticed a well-dressed figure standing outside the dormitory. The man, impeccably dressed in a suit, straightened up and adjusted his jacket upon spotting Lance, offering a polite smile as he stepped forward. It was clear that he had come specifically for Lance, and he wasn't trying to hide it. More importantly, he had an unmistakably Chinese face. He had neat, slightly graying hair, gentle features, and a shy smile. It seemed like he was a bit self-conscious about his teeth, as he didn't open his mouth fully when he smiled. Even though all Asians might look similar to some, Lance could tell right away that this man was of Chinese descent. Lance didn't slow his pace, but the gray-haired gentleman took a half-step forward, greeting him without obstructing his path. With a smile, he introduced himself. "Lance, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Donald Yi, a sports agent." As he spoke, he handed Lance his business card. Lance wasn't surprised. In the past month, he had already received business cards from more than a dozen agents. Although the NCAA strictly prohibits agents from approaching players, everyone knows it's impossible to enforce fully. As long as agents don't bribe players or their families or make any verbal agreements, just meeting and talking is overlooked by most. In fact, players are allowed to sign with agents immediately after the national championship game. But no agent waits that long to make their move. The battle for players intensifies during the championship, testing both the agent's insight and decision-making. Even though Lance was a running back, a position currently undervalued in the NFL, and even though this was only his first year playing football, agents still had their eyes on him. And it wasn't just a few. The number of opportunistic agents was much higher than expected. At first, Lance had been a little excited, feeling like a life-changing opportunity was right in front of him. But he quickly calmed down. These agents might not really think he was special, they were just casting a wide net, hoping to catch an unsuspecting rabbit. Soon, Lance regained his composure. If, and it was still a big if, Lance decided to go pro and build a new life around football, a sports agent would be crucial. As mentioned before, the current market for running backs in the league was pretty grim. If Lance wanted to break through, shattering those barriers and moving beyond the limitations of the position, just performing well wouldn't be enough. He would need an exceptional agent. An agent he could trust. But Lance wasn't in a rush. He knew that as long as he continued to perform well, better and better agents would come to him. The truly top-tier players were always the ones who held the power of choice. And now, here was another agent. What surprised Lance was that the man in front of him was Chinese. In the world of football, you rarely see Chinese faces, whether on the field or off. Lance had never encountered a Chinese sports agent before. After glancing at the business card, Lance gave a polite smile, then tucked the card into his pocket. "Thank you. I'll consider it." With that, Lance kept walking, showing no extra interest just because the man was Chinese. "No problem, Lance. If you have any questions, feel free to call me anytime, 24/7. The gray-haired gentleman didn't follow him but stood in place, calling out after him. And that was it. Lance was surprised. Despite telling himself not to be too trusting, his steps slowed, and he glanced back. The man was still standing there, smiling warmly, as if he had known Lance would stop and turn around. That smile made Lance laugh. After hesitating for a moment, he finally spoke. "So, was that reverse psychology?" The gray-haired gentleman spread his hands. "Old trick, but effective." So, he admitted it. There was no hesitation or denial. Standing tall, the gentleman met Lance's gaze with a calm smile. "At least now, we have the chance to talk, right?" Chapter 111, The Third Visit. A gentle breeze blew, and the sunlight was warm. The gray-haired gentleman stood calmly in place, patient and composed. He was unlike any agent Lance had encountered before. Curiosity arose naturally within Lance, and he couldn't help but ask, "What if I hadn't turned around and just kept walking?" The gray-haired gentleman smiled. "You would have called me." Lance remained skeptical. "And what if I didn't call you?" The gray-haired man responded smoothly, "I'd still be here next week, at the same time, in the same place." Without waiting for Lance's reply, the man continued, "And if you still didn't respond, I'd be here again the following week, same time, same place, just like today." A smile crept onto Lance's face. The gray-haired man noticed Lance had caught on. "Just as Zhuge Liang was worth 3 visits to the thatched cottage, you are too." Lance chuckled, finding the man amusing. "If I'm Zhuge Liang, then you must be." The gray-haired gentleman shook his head quickly, "No, no, no. It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that I know your value, and I believe you deserve the best treatment." Lance looked at the man closely, assessing the sincerity behind his words and expressions. Finally, he spread his hands. "All right, I admit I fell for it." Jesus Christ. Out of nowhere, Lance sighed. The gray-haired man looked curious. "What is it?" Lance waved dismissively. "Nothing. I just remembered a cheesy line, 'Woman, you've caught my attention, and now I've got goosebumps.'" "No, stop. Let's not think about it." End of scene. The gray-haired man was caught off guard for a second, but then he burst into laughter, realizing what Lance meant. "Has anyone ever complimented your sense of humor?" Lance shrugged lazily, appearing harmless and relaxed, with none of the fierce energy he displayed on the field. "Do scouts assess a player's humor during evaluations?" The The gray-haired man chuckled, acknowledging the joke but shifting gears quickly. I'm sure I'm not the first agent to approach you, and I won't be the last. And I'm sure you're aware that being Asian in football is seen as a disadvantage. But disadvantages can become advantages. Before me, there must have been agents more eloquent, with more impressive resumes and greater advantages, all trying to paint a grand vision for you. But I have my own judgments and my own strengths. All I'm asking for is a chance to have an open conversation. Lance raised his chin slightly. So, your last name? On the man's business card, it was spelled Yi, which could be pronounced as E, but when the man introduced himself, he had pronounced it You. Lance had noticed this small detail earlier when glancing at the card and now brought it up as a way to shift the conversation. In fact, Lance was subtly trying to disrupt the man's rhythm. Conversations, like everything, have a flow. Lance might have fallen into the man's reverse psychology trick earlier, but he wasn't about to lose control of the dialogue. He was attempting to take charge. Sure enough, the gray-haired man looked slightly surprised that Lance had picked up on the nuance. You. My surname is Yu. But there's no such vowel sound in English, and people often pronounce it as you, which is inconvenient. So we settled on another phonetic spelling. But yes, my real surname is Yu. Lance raised his chin again. So, what sets you apart from other agents? Sensing Lance's scrutinizing gaze, the man immediately understood. Still, he remained composed and unflustered. He didn't try to evade the question and answered candidly. You're Chinese, and I'm Chinese, but I'm not playing that card. In fact, I won't lie, I can't speak a word of Chinese. Lance was taken aback. Are you a third-generation immigrant? The man smiled gently. Second generation. But when my parents immigrated in the 1950s, they didn't really use Mandarin much for communication. In the 1950s, Mandarin hadn't yet been fully promoted, and many regions in China still primarily spoke local dialects. Lance asked, so, what language did you speak with your parents? The man smiled and said, Toishanese. Hardly anyone speaks it nowadays, I'm sure. Lance thought for a moment but still wasn't certain. Cantonese. The gray-haired man's smile widened slightly. Taishan dialect, from the western part of Guangdong. Ah, I see. Lance waved his hand dismissively. Well, that's a whole new language to me. The man smoothly redirected the conversation. I can guess that most of the agents who've approached you so far are drawn to you primarily because of your Chinese heritage. Lance responded with a knowing look. You can say that again. The gray-haired man paused, then smiled, understanding the implication. All right, 100% of them. Sure, they all want to replicate the success of Yao Ming's entry into the NBA. But football and basketball are completely different sports. In basketball, there are only 5 players on the court. Whether you play well or not, you're always in the spotlight. Naturally, Yao's success had a massive promotional effect. But in football, there are over 50 players on a team. Even if you perform well, it's hard to guarantee the spotlight will always be on you. So, if they're hoping to use you to capture the Chinese market, I believe they'll soon lose patience because things won't be that simple. You'll need time to grow, and the Chinese market will need time to develop. It's not something that can be achieved overnight. We need to remain patient and build slowly. Lance didn't rush to respond or interrupt. He remained patient, quietly listening. Then, at just the right moment, Lance spoke. And what about you? The gray-haired man exuded confidence. In my eyes, you're a running back first. I see the value of a running back in you. It's only after that I see you as a Chinese player. We both know that running backs in the league are currently hitting a wall. I won't make unrealistic promises, telling you that we can break down that barrier overnight because that's just not realistic. But if you asked me who has the potential to break through that barrier, I could give you an answer right now. The gray-haired man didn't say another word, simply looking at Lance. The answer was clear. Lance smiled knowingly. The man continued. In the world of competitive sports, the market is important, but skill is even more important. If you enter the NFL and end up sitting on the bench or only rotating in occasionally, believe me, the Asian market won't care about you. So, before we discuss anything else, you are first and foremost a running back, a talented running back who will continue to grow into one of the best. Once you have the necessary skills, the labels others have placed on you will become your leverage, turning into your voice. By then, I will be your support and your partner. Together, we'll break through the barriers in front of running backs. He didn't raise his voice, but his words carried a calm yet powerful conviction. This agent clearly knew what he was doing, and he had come prepared. Lance looked back at the gray-haired man, smiling brightly as he asked, "So, where does your confidence come from?" Chapter 112, The Hidden Giant. Donald E. looked at Lance, admiration gleaming in his eyes. First, despite all the sweet talk and high promises, Lance remained calm and collected. And second, throughout their entire conversation, though they subtly vied for control, Lance, seemingly passive, had not been swept into Donald's rhythm and maintained his own pace. In just a brief interaction, Lance had already left a strong impression on Donald, confirming his belief in Lance's potential. But the more he was impressed, the more Donald knew he needed to remain calm and patient. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. Faced with Lance's direct question, Donald slowed down, offering a calm smile. "My confidence doesn't come from me, but from you," he said. "I've watched all your game footage, spring training, scrimmages, and even team practices. And not just once. I can see your rawness, your growth, your intelligence. It's clear that for you, football is more than just physical combat, right?" Lance didn't answer. Instead, he gazed curiously at Donald, waiting for his response. "Chess." Donald gave a simple reply, causing a small smile to flicker across Lance's face. "Football requires strategy, patience, and competition. Physicality is the foundation of everything, but what truly decides victory is intelligence. Just like a chess match. Or a battlefield. Right now, you've only been playing football for 6 months, yet you've absorbed knowledge like a sponge and transformed yourself. So, what will you be like in another 6 months? I'm very excited to see." There was no doubt that the gray-haired gentleman was both sincere and cunning. Lance suspected that this entire meeting had been meticulously planned, rehearsed in Donald's mind to perfection. In other words, everything that had happened so far was likely orchestrated. And if that was true, Lance had to admit that Donald was thorough and well-prepared. Out of nowhere, without any warning, Lance suddenly had a thought, and he decided to throw it out there, disrupting both his own and Donald's plans. "So, do you recommend I stay with the Crimson Tide for another year or enter the draft and go pro?" Even Lance himself hadn't seriously considered this question yet, but now he posed it. Donald was clearly surprised by the unexpected question. But after a brief moment of surprise, Donald quickly composed himself and confidently responded, "Go pro." Lance raised an eyebrow, slightly taken aback. It wasn't the answer that surprised him. Agents almost always wanted their players to go pro, but it was Donald's unwavering certainty that caught Lance's attention, revealing a hint of steely resolve. "There are 2 reasons," Donald explained. First, the NCAA is a non-profit organization. Players don't earn a penny playing here, yet the NCAA's broadcasting revenue rivals that of the NFL. So, where does all that money go? Alabama is a public university, so the situation is slightly better. And Sabin is a good coach who truly has your future in mind. But private universities? That's a different story. He left that point hanging, the implication clear. Second, transitioning from the NCAA to the NFL requires an adjustment period. Many players hit a rookie wall. In football, the professional game and the college game are like 2 different sports. Here, coaches often encourage players to stay in the NCAA, to take their time, playing until their junior or even senior year. That advice makes sense, they need time to develop. Otherwise, entering the NFL too soon might lead to getting crushed and quickly forgotten. But you're different. I believe you've already fully adapted to the intensity of the NCAA. Even if you stayed another season, your room for growth here would be minimal. You'd benefit more from moving up a level, opening the door to a new world, and entering the NFL to challenge yourself at a higher difficulty. By this point, the message was crystal clear. Donald saw the spark in Lance's eyes. He knew that Lance had already guessed what his next line would be, but he continued with a smile, "Because I believe in you." Lance's expression clearly said, "I knew it." Donald spread his hands wide, openly inviting any scrutiny from Lance, waiting to see if his answer had satisfied the young player. But Lance didn't offer any critique. Not verbally, not even through his facial expressions. He was utterly unreadable. Instead, he simply remarked, "Has anyone ever told you that you'd be great at selling stuff?" Donald blinked in confusion. Selling stuff. It seemed this gray-haired gentleman still needed to brush up on some modern slang. Lance didn't plan on sticking around much longer. He had heard what he needed to hear. After all, agents were all smooth talkers. Even though this one had taken a different approach, he was still, at his core, an agent. Only time would reveal the truth about him. "Goodbye, Mr. Yu," Lance said in perfect Mandarin. Donald, caught off guard, was unable to respond immediately. The conversation had abruptly ended, and Lance walked away, leaving the agent's carefully laid plans in disarray. But Donald quickly composed himself. "Is that the proper pronunciation of my name? Could you teach me?" You. Old you. Old you. Wait, why does that sound like there's an extra syllable? Goodbye, old you. Lance didn't stop, walking further away as he waved, disappearing into the dormitory, leaving Donald standing alone. Donald had thought everything was going according to plan when Lance had stopped to engage. But in the end, Lance had disrupted his game. However, Donald wasn't frustrated. In fact, he was even more excited. This kid was smarter than he had imagined. Things were getting interesting. As for Lance, once he turned a corner and was out of sight, he pulled out his phone and turned to a search engine. Forgive him, but Lance knew very little about football. Even famous players meant little to him, let alone the agents behind them. Lance figured that for a Chinese-American agent working in football, he'd either be a complete unknown or a big name in the industry. But the search results were surprising. Donald Yu was indeed a professional football agent. He had registered his agency in 1999. However, he wasn't a complete nobody, nor was he a household name in the industry. He occupied a middle ground, which didn't quite fit Lance's expectations. What was going on? Lance quickly found Donald Yu's agency's homepage. It was clean, simple, and modest. Compared to other agencies that proudly displayed their star clients on the front page, this website was almost too plain, to the point of being bare. So, who exactly were Donald Yu's clients? After navigating through the site, Lance clicked on the Clients section, which revealed that they represented athletes in football, golf, and baseball. When he clicked on the football section, a list of clients finally appeared. Kevin Anderson. Lance had heard of tennis player Kevin Anderson, but this was a different Kevin Anderson. Josh Boyce. Lance hadn't heard of him either, and the face didn't ring a bell. Tom Brady. Wait, wasn't that a name he'd seen somewhere before? Chapter 113, Silent Earnings. Donald Yu, age 46, is a professional sports agent. In 1998, he was just a junior legal advisor at a sports agency, handling paperwork for professional athletes while looking for a breakthrough in his career. That year, a college scout recommended a senior quarterback named Tom Brady to Donald Yu. Brady was the starting QB for the Michigan Wolverines, and this opened a window of opportunity for the young legal advisor. But Donald Yu didn't rush things. He watched every one of Brady's games, including the Orange Bowl that year, where Michigan staged a 14-point comeback to defeat the Alabama Crimson Tide. Despite Brady's impressive performances for Michigan, often leading comeback wins that earned him the media nickname, Comeback Kid, he was viewed as frail and unimpressive in training camps. Many doubted whether he could handle the physical demands of the NFL, and his draft prospects were dim. Several agents approached Brady, but in the end, he chose Donald Yu. The following year, at the draft, Brady wasn't highly regarded and wasn't selected until the 6th round, as the 199th pick by the New England Patriots. 15 years later, Brady had led the Patriots to 7 Super Bowl appearances and won 4 championships. Donald Yu's foresight and decisions back then were proven right. Without a doubt, Brady is now one of the NFL's biggest superstars. But Donald Yu never flaunted his success. He stayed low-key, quietly making a fortune behind the scenes. In 2007, it was Donald Yu, as Brady's agent, who announced the birth of Brady's first child, a boy. During the media frenzy surrounding the announcement, many within the football industry, including experts who study agents, found themselves puzzled. Who is Donald Yu? Imagine, in the digital age of 2016, when the internet and smartphones are ubiquitous, and social media is all-pervasive, Lance couldn't even find a single photo of Donaldy with Tom Brady. Is that possible? There were two explanations. First, Lance had encountered a scam artist, someone pretending to be Donaldy to con people. Second, perhaps some photos of Ye and Brady do exist, but no one knows who Donald is, and the focus of all the attention is solely on Brady. Without the right search terms, finding you would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. This isn't the age where good wine needs no bush. Lance was used to seeing agents' names all over the sports news: Jeff Schwartz, Jorge Mendez, Jonathan Barnett, Scott Boras, Rich Paul, and so on. These agents' exposure levels rival those of top athletes. In a way, they've become celebrities themselves, using media coverage to boost their influence, creating a kind of mythos that helps them achieve more. But Donaldy has stayed as humble as ever, quietly doing his job, which makes him a refreshing anomaly. More importantly, Donaldy's client list in football isn't the longest, but it's far from short. Julian Edelman, wide receiver. Jimmy Garoppolo, quarterback. Sean Payton, head coach. And many more. When browsing through Donaldy's list of football clients, Lance noticed that they were arranged alphabetically by last name. For the NFL, Tom Brady might be the most influential and dominant quarterback, but for Donaldy's agency, Brady doesn't seem any more significant than when he was a sixth-round draft pick back in 1999, at least, on the surface. Things were getting interesting. Compared to the cookie-cutter, suit-clad agents Lance had met before, this Donaldy was much more intriguing. At this point, the fact that he was Chinese-American no longer mattered much, it was just a bonus. The real question now was about his capabilities. Lance couldn't help but wonder, what would Donaldy say when they met next time? Exhaling deeply, Lance returned to his dorm to change and gather his belongings. But before he could push open the door, it swung open from the inside. His roommate, Simon Hunter, was just stepping out. "Hey, man, practice done?" Simon asked. Lance glanced behind Hunter, noticing the empty room. "Flying solo today?" With a righteous expression, Simon responded, "What do you take me for?" "Finals are coming up, man. It's study time. I'm a model student, all about the books." "I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm heading to the library now, or there'll be no seats left." He finished by puffing out his chest, standing tall as if making a grand declaration. Lance pointed to the books in Simon's hand. "Are you sure?" On top of the stack was the December issue of a men's magazine, one of Simon's favorites if Lance remembered correctly. Simon's face stiffened. He discreetly tucked the magazine deeper into the pile, then once again straightened up, looking Lance in the eye with unwavering determination. Lance nodded approvingly. "That's more like it. By the way, is it true there won't be any seats left after dinner? Some guys on the football team need to catch up on their studies. We were planning to head to the library tonight, but it's a big group. Should we go grab spots now?" Simon waved his hand dismissively. "No need, no need. The Crimson Tide is the pride of the University of Alabama. Everywhere you go, there are cheers and whistles. When you walk into the library, people will gladly give up their seats for you. And if not, there's always the study rooms the school sets aside for athletes to use. They're designed so you guys always have a place to study." Lance grinned. "Got it. Enjoy your studying." Simon smiled. "You too." They high-fived and parted ways, heading in opposite directions. While the Crimson Tide, riding a wave of success, was busy worrying about academics. Lamar Jackson was on the verge of a breakdown. Stay calm, Lamar. You just fell asleep. It was only a nightmare. Don't panic, everything's fine." It was just a dream. People around him were trying to help Lamar regain his composure. Lamar wiped the drool from his mouth, suddenly realizing he had dozed off while studying in the library. So, what had happened? "Lamar, it was just a nightmare. You're awake now, don't worry. It won't come true." "So, what was it? What did you dream about that left you looking like you'd seen Cthulhu?" Of course, they had to bring it up. Immediately, Lamar's mind filled with the image of Lance. Damn it. It had been 3 days since the Alabama Crimson Tide had played LSU, and yet Lance still haunted his thoughts. Lance, Lance, Lance. Never-ending, relentless, inescapable Lance. He was Lamar Jackson, for crying out loud, but everywhere he went, people only wanted to talk about Lance. Reporters bugged him, coaches and teammates brought him up, and now, he couldn't even escape him in his dreams. Lamar, don't tell me you dreamed about Lance, someone asked. Lamar, damn it. Chapter 114, Haunting Presence. Lamar, did you really dream about Lance? Ha ha ha, ha. It was clearly a joke, a light-hearted tease meant to ease the tension in the air. After all, Jackson had just woken up suddenly and stormed out, frightening everyone studying in the library. To lighten the mood, someone had cracked a joke. The guy who made the comment had a self-satisfied grin on his face, clearly proud of his quick wit. His expression practically screamed, "Come on, someone praise me for being clever." But when he looked up, what he saw was Lamar Jackson glaring at him, his eyes filled with fury, practically burning with rage. The laughter immediately died. In what felt like an instant, Jackson was no longer several yards away but standing right in front of him, glaring face to face, their noses almost touching. Hick. The guy was so terrified he didn't even have time for his knees to shake, he just hiccuped and stood there, frozen in place. Jackson, like a lion fixating on its prey, stared him down. No one is allowed to mention that name. No one. Jackson's words came out through gritted teeth, one deliberate word after another. Then, in a flash, Jackson spun around and stormed out of the library like a tornado. Outside, a roar of frustration echoed through the air. Oh. Ah. The whole space seemed to shake with his outburst. Everyone in sight pulled their shoulders up, exchanging nervous glances, but no one dared say a word. Even without Jackson explicitly saying it, the pressure in Louisville's campus was palpable. Louisville wasn't a traditional football powerhouse, but it wasn't a weak team either. They had won 8 conference championships in their history, but they'd never captured a league championship or advanced to the national championship game. Nor had they ever produced a Heisman Trophy winner. A classic case of being strong within the conference but faltering on the national stage. This year, however, everything seemed to be different. Led by sophomore quarterback Lamar Jackson, the Louisville Cardinals were enjoying unprecedented attention. Not only were they dominating their season and breaking NCAA records, but Jackson was also leading the race for the Heisman Trophy, with a strong chance of becoming the school's first-ever winner of the prestigious award. Though they had suffered a tough loss to Clemson Tigers earlier in the season, the team quickly rebounded and got back on track. Just 2 weeks ago, after easily defeating Wake Forest, the Louisville Cardinals climbed back to 3rd place in the NCAA rankings. Currently, the NCAA team rankings stood as follows. Alabama Crimson Tide, Clemson Tigers, Louisville Cardinals. Conveniently, the top 3 contenders for the Heisman Trophy, Jackson, Lance, and Watson, were from these 3 teams, making the competition even fiercer. From all appearances, this was Louisville's best chance to make history, both in terms of winning the national championship and producing a Heisman winner. However, 3 days ago, Alabama Crimson Tide faced a tough test but managed to defeat the LSU Tigers, keeping their undefeated season alive. Clemson Tigers, not to be outdone, also secured a resounding victory to stay on Alabama's heels in their pursuit of a perfect season. Meanwhile, Louisville Cardinals suffered a shocking upset, losing to an unranked Houston Cougars team. Losing was bad enough, but to make matters worse, Jackson had a terrible game, practically invisible on the field. The final score, 36-10. It was a familiar scoreline for Louisville this season, except this time, they were on the wrong end. Their point total was the lowest of the season, and Jackson's stats were abysmal, with almost no impact in the first half. It wasn't until the second half, late in the game, that Jackson started to show signs of life, but by then, it was too little, too late. This performance reignited a long-standing criticism of dual-threat quarterbacks, particularly Jackson. With such a physically taxing style of play, how long could Jackson sustain his performance? How long could he maintain his high level of play during a single game? Over the course of a season? What about the playoffs? And what about his entire career? After the game, Jackson became the media's favorite punching bag, as reporters gleefully dissected his poor performance. To make matters worse, comparisons with Lance were inevitable. In Alabama's game against LSU, Lance had also struggled in the first half, but he came alive in the second half, leading his team to victory with 2 touchdowns and boosting their morale. Without comparisons, there would be no sting. In contrast, Jackson seemed to be following a season-long pattern, strong in the first half, but fading in the second. So, how did Jackson respond to all this? At first, he tried to deflect the questions, but somehow, the conversation always circled back to Lance. Finally, Jackson lost his temper. "I'm going to beat him." Jackson made his declaration. Like sharks smelling blood in the water, the reporters pounced. "Do you mean in the national championship game, or the Heisman Trophy race?" In the regular season, Alabama and Louisville wouldn't face each other, and they likely wouldn't meet in a bowl game either. The only way the two teams could clash would be in the national championship game, where Alabama, Louisville, and Clemson were the top contenders. Both. The reporters were thrilled. "Excuse me, what?" Jackson practically shouted, "National championship and Heisman Trophy, we're going to be the ones smiling at the end. Believe me, we are the real champions." After dropping these bombshells, Jackson finally made his exit. Of course, the mischievous reporters relayed Jackson's comments to Lance, eagerly awaiting his response. Oh. The reporters couldn't believe their ears, but they hadn't misheard. Lance simply nodded, acknowledging that he had heard them. When they pressed for more, Lance clarified, "Right now, we're not focused on the national championship or any bowl games. We're preparing for our next opponent, Mississippi State. As for the national championship, we'll think about it when the time comes, once the opponent is set and the game is upon us. For now, we need to stay grounded and prepare for each game. There are still 3 weeks left in the regular season, and anything can happen. The entire landscape could change. No team can afford to relax and bask in the sun." It was a display of traditional Eastern humility. But in truth, the real reason behind Lance's comments was a team meeting that Coach Sabin had held to warn them. The NCAA is full of strong teams, and one loss can change everything, shaking up the rankings, bowl game matchups, and national championship berths. Even with a 9-0 record, the Crimson Tide couldn't afford to get cocky. After all, last year's Clemson Tigers had been a prime example of this. However, when Lance's words were relayed to Jackson, they took on a completely different meaning. Lance doesn't even consider Lamar Jackson a threat. He'll think about facing Louisville only when they make it to the national championship. No further words were necessary, Jackson was already on the verge of exploding. Chapter 115, Worlds Apart. Storming out of the library, fuming with rage, Lamar Jackson stood at the entrance, taking deep breaths of fresh air. Even then, he couldn't calm himself. Unable to hold it in, he threw his head back and roared at the sky. He shouted several more times, his fists clenched, as he forcefully expelled the frustration and heat that had been building up inside him. Finally, he could breathe a little easier. But still, it wasn't enough. He roared again, scaring the birds from the trees. Students passing by hurriedly avoided him, steering clear of the star quarterback of the Louisville football team, who seemed to have turned into a wild beast, howling at the sun. Before long, a bubble of empty space formed around Jackson, but he wasn't concerned with the curious and terrified stares. He needed peace. Sitting down on the steps, his head lowered, Jackson seriously began to reflect, how did things get to this point? A running back. A running back. A running back. He still couldn't believe it. A running back. Truthfully, you couldn't blame Jackson for his arrogance, because reality backed him up. If you looked at the salaries of the 32 NFL teams in 2023, ignoring the elite superstars, because once players reached the top, their salary structures became so complex that it was hard to gauge the true market value of each position. The average salary of each position gave a clear picture of the league's overall value system for offense, defense, and specific roles. The player with the highest average salary wasn't the quarterback, it was the left tackle, the one responsible for protecting the quarterback's blind side. Yes, while top-tier quarterbacks may claim the highest salaries overall, on average, left tackles were the most expensive, with an average annual salary of $8.19 million. Next came the quarterback, with an average salary of $6.11 million. On the other end of the spectrum, the lowest paid position, unsurprisingly, was the holder, the player on special teams responsible for holding the ball for the kicker. Don't underestimate the importance of a holder, though. NFL history is filled with games that were lost because the holder made a mistake, ruining game-winning field goals. The average salary for a holder was $1.09 million. In general, the average salary for offensive players was $3.46 million, for defensive players, it was $3.08 million, and for special teams, it was $1.76 million. Clearly, NFL teams invested more heavily in their offenses. Zooming in on the offense. Among all offensive positions, only 3 had an average salary below $3 million: the running back, the tight end, and the offensive guard. A few years ago, tight ends had the lowest average salary on offense, but thanks to stars like Jimmy Graham of the New Orleans Saints and Rob Gronkowski of the New England Patriots, the position's value skyrocketed. Now, it was the running back who had the lowest average salary among offensive players, just $2.1 million. In the past, all the way up until the 1980s, running backs were the second highest paid players on the team, right behind quarterbacks. Now, they had fallen so far. It was a reminder of how the tides of history could shift, and no one could stop it. This was the reality. A running back was like a blade of grass, tough and weathered by the elements. A quarterback was like a precious gem, handled with care, shielded by the offensive line, with even the left tackle's high salary designed to protect him. The difference between the two was night and day. No matter how Jackson thought about it, he couldn't understand why people were comparing him to Lance. How had that guy suddenly risen to prominence? In Jackson's mind, football was a game decided by quarterbacks. All other players were just supporting cast, including running backs, especially on his team, the Louisville Cardinals. Naturally, Jackson's true competition lay in other quarterbacks: Watson, Darnold, Mayfield. These were his real rivals. Whether for the Heisman Trophy or the national championship, these were the enemies he needed to defeat. A running back. Why was a running back trying to crash the quarterback's party? As far as Jackson was concerned, Alabama's quarterback, Hurts, was nothing more than an overhyped high school kid. Alabama won games solely because of their defense, and whatever points their offense scored came on the back of that defense smothering the opposition. The same applied to Alabama's recent game against LSU. If it hadn't been for the Crimson Tide's defense shutting down LSU's ineffective offense in the first half, the game would have been over before Lance even had a chance to make a difference. In Jackson's mind, even if Louisville faced Alabama in the national championship, the main matchup would be between him and Alabama's defense. A mere running back shouldn't be hogging the spotlight. And yet, the media wouldn't leave him alone. Lance, Lance, Lance. It never ended. Now that Louisville had lost and Alabama had won, the narrative around Lance only grew stronger. He had surpassed Watson and climbed to second in the Heisman Trophy odds, closing in on Jackson. The pressure was mounting. Whether Jackson liked it or not, the NCAA spotlight was now squarely focused on Jackson versus Watson versus Lance, and this narrative wasn't going away anytime soon. Lance doesn't even consider Lamar Jackson a threat. He'll worry about Louisville only if they make it to the national championship. Hearing that quote again made Jackson's blood boil. He had never even considered Lance a threat, right? Wasn't he the one who said that first? Now Lance was acting like he was the one calling the shots. Anger surged through him, but just as it reached its peak, Jackson found a sliver of clarity. Fine, if people wanted a spectacle, he would show them. He would prove them wrong. If Louisville could make it to the national championship and beat Alabama, all those doubters could finally shut their mouths, right? Originally, Jackson had been focused on facing Watson in the national championship game, hoping to avenge his regular season loss to Clemson and prove he was the most talented quarterback in the country. But now, with Lance surpassing Watson, Jackson had a new target to beat in the championship game. When the game ended, Jackson was certain Lance's expression would be priceless. He could already imagine stamping that look of defeat into his memory. He couldn't wait to shove all those trash-talking words back down Lance's throat. Just picturing it made Jackson burst into laughter. Conveniently, Louisville's next game was against their historic rival, the Kentucky Wildcats. Perfect timing. Sorry, Kentucky, but Jackson was brimming with anger and needed to blow off some steam. Kentucky was about to become his punching bag, a team he could crush, pulverize, and steamroll. Chapter 116, The Sideline Spectacle. Roll Tide, roll. Roll Tide, roll. A new week brought a new game. The Crimson Tide were hosting Mississippi State University at Bryant-Denny Stadium. After 3 consecutive hard-fought games, Alabama finally had a breather. Their opponent this week was unranked and considered a weaker team. But no one was underestimating their opponent. Louisville's shocking upset loss the previous week served as a valuable lesson. Without needing Nick Saban's reminder, the Crimson Tide captains were already cautioning the team, making sure no one got overconfident or took the opposition lightly. Bryant-Denny Stadium was packed to the brim, a sea of red surging with excitement. The noise was deafening. With the stadium announcer hyping up the crowd, the atmosphere built to a fever pitch, setting the stage for Lance and his teammates to make their entrance. At the players' tunnel, a large inflatable arch stood at the entrance. Cheerleaders lined both sides, and the team mascot was leading the cheers as Allen and the Crimson Tide prepared to storm the field. This was one of the perks of playing at home, a ritual for every home game that made each one feel like a festival. Lance. Clark called out, but when Lance looked back with a questioning gaze, Clark suddenly seemed nervous. Lance, confused, shot him a curious look, which made Clark even more anxious, his words stumbling out. Seeing this, Jacobs couldn't help but step in. "They're calling for you up front." Jacobs nodded toward the front, where Humphrey was waving his arms, yelling, "Hey, rookie. Come on over." Even though the season was nearly over, Lance's nickname on the team was still Rookie, a reminder that he had joined the Crimson Tide mid-career. Lance nodded to Humphrey and gave Clark a puzzled look. "You all right, buddy?" Clark nodded repeatedly, unable to speak. Jacobs rolled his eyes. "He's got a stitch." Clark nodded harder. Lance tilted his head. "You're acting a bit weird, but okay." Shrugging it off, Lance walked toward Humphrey, who quickly slung an arm around him. Watching Lance leave, Clark finally exhaled in relief. "Thanks. You saved me from totally blowing it." Jacobs gave him a skeptical look. "Did I, though?" Meanwhile, Lance followed Humphrey, thinking there was something important. But it turned out Humphrey was just relaying a message. Allen had asked to see him. Lance walked to the front of the group and found Allen warming up in place. "Ah, Lance, good timing. I almost forgot to tell you." The noise in the stadium was too overwhelming, especially near the tunnel's exit. Even though Allen was shouting, Lance could barely catch bits and pieces of what he was saying. Allen gave up, gesturing toward the field and mouthing, "Let's head out first." Lance was about to nod in response when, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted someone seated nearby, sitting calmly in the crowd of red. In the midst of the roaring tide of fans, the figure wasn't immediately noticeable, but they were looking directly at him with a small wave and a smile. It was Donald Ye. Even though he was wearing a Crimson Tide jersey, Lance could see the shirt underneath. Donald's small figure seemed like it could be swallowed up by the crowd at any moment, yet he appeared entirely at ease. He raised his beer and gave Lance a friendly salute. Lance, not one to shy away, casually waved back at Donald. Just then, Allen patted Lance's shoulder. It was time to take the field. Lance jogged alongside Allen, following the team's usual entrance routine. But after a few steps, he realized something was off. Where was everyone? Wait. Where was everyone? Lance stopped and turned around, only to find that, led by Allen, the team had slowed their pace, some even stopping altogether, leaving Lance charging forward all by himself. A prank. A light bulb went off in Lance's head as he recalled Clark's odd behavior. He'd been distracted by Donald's presence and hadn't noticed the setup. But why? Before Lance could puzzle it out, the roaring noise in Bryant-Denny Stadium began to quiet. The shift from frenzy to calm was so stark that Lance's ears tingled with the sudden silence. Instinctively, he looked up. Then the sound came rushing back, louder than ever. "He's here, he's there, he's everywhere, it's the Edge Runner, Lance, Lance, Lance." Again and again. "He's here, he's there, he's everywhere, it's the Edge Runner, Lance, Lance, Lance." The entire stadium erupted in unison, hands clapping in rhythm. When they shouted Lance's name, they jumped and stomped 3 times, sending a wave of energy through the stadium. The combined force of 100,000 people felt like a storm shaking the very foundation of Bryant-Denny. A ripple of red spread across the stadium, like wind rustling through a field of wheat. Among the sea of Crimson Tide jerseys, a wave of white emerged, spelling out a message that circled the entire stadium. Lance. Happy birthday. Lance was stunned. Completely caught off guard, his eyes grew warm as he struggled to hold back the tears welling up. He quickly looked up at the sky, trying to keep his emotions in check, but the cheers continued to roar in his ears. Today, November 12th, just happened to be the day after Lance's birthday. Normally, fans would remember their favorite players' birthdays and celebrate them like family. In this small town, Crimson Tide players were like the town's children, beloved by everyone. But this level of celebration, that required something special. First, the Crimson Tide had won a tough game last week, and Lance had played a crucial role once again. Second, today's game was at home, the perfect setting. And third, it was Lance's 21st birthday. In America, while some people celebrate turning 18 or 20, turning 21 is much more significant. It symbolizes full adulthood. At 21, you can legally drink. All of these factors had come together to create this moment. Lance was completely caught off guard. He hadn't expected this. His parents, who followed the Chinese lunar calendar, had already celebrated his birthday 2 weeks ago over the phone. Naturally, Lance hadn't thought much about his Western birthday, so he was totally in the dark about the surprise. It was clear now that his teammates had been in on it, helping the town's residents pull off this special gift. Before the season started, there had been concerns about how the Crimson Tide would fare without Derrick Henry. People worried that defending the title would be an uphill battle. But now, they had their answer. Despite Henry's absence, a new rising star named Lance had emerged to lead the charge. The Crimson Tide was still as fearsome and dominant as ever. The stadium roared with a thunderous wave of sound, crashing down on Lance from every side. Standing alone on the field, Lance seemed so small and insignificant. Yet, with the entire stadium chanting his name, that small figure grew in stature until it felt like he could hold up the sky itself. Today was something special. Chapter 117, Opposite Directions. He's here, he's there, he's everywhere, it's the edge runner, Lance, Lance, Lance. Bryant-Denny Stadium was shaking. The world itself seemed to tremble as deafening cheers erupted like a volcanic explosion, a continuous roar that filled the air. The sensation of boiling blood and the heat of excitement were impossible to ignore. Anyone in the stadium would find themselves swept up in the moment. Donald was no exception. He understood that Lance's stellar performance as a running back was largely thanks to his teammates. From sidelines and team footage, he had seen that Lance got along well with the defensive squad. Now, being at the stadium, he could feel the passion of the fans. In just 6 short months, Lance had clearly won over the hearts of this small town. Despite having witnessed Tom Brady's triumphant Super Bowl moments more than once and having felt the frenzy of North America's greatest sporting event, Donald was still captivated by the feverish excitement unfolding before him today. But despite the cheers and energy, he couldn't quite adapt to the outpouring of enthusiasm around him. He stood somewhat awkwardly among the sea of fervent faces, feeling out of place. Soon, however, he realized he wasn't alone in feeling this way. Just ahead, a small group of about 20 or 30 people sat directly behind the Crimson Tide coaching staff. Normally, a group this size would be insignificant in a stadium of 100,000 people. Even though they were seated right behind the coaches, they wouldn't have drawn much attention, except for the fact that they were all wearing black jerseys. In a sea of crimson and white, the black stood out sharply. Men in Black 3 had come out years ago, so it wasn't like they were doing some kind of performance art. And why here, at Bryant-Denny Stadium? Upon closer inspection, it became clear that the group wasn't wearing suits, but jerseys. Could they be fans of another team trying to stir up trouble? After all, Mississippi State's colors weren't black. Were they not worried about their safety, pulling a stunt like that in Bryant-Denny Stadium? But then he finally saw it clearly. They were wearing Jacksonville Jaguars jerseys. No wonder they weren't concerned about being attacked. Clearly, NFL fans had no reason to fear for their safety in a college football stadium. Plus, Jacksonville wasn't far from Tuscaloosa, only about 470 miles, or a 7-hour drive. Practically neighbors. But why were Jacksonville Jaguars fans here? More importantly, they seemed to be organized, disciplined, and making a statement. It was as if they were openly declaring something, hoping everyone would notice. Donald couldn't help but recall a rumor he'd heard. He hadn't paid much attention to it at the time, but now it seemed worth taking seriously. His gaze drifted back to the center of the field, where the figure at the heart of the cheers and applause stood, Lance, now surrounded by a swarm of Crimson Tide players. "Haha, Lance is crying. Oh, Lance, are you all emotional now? Look at our little rookie with his red eyes. So cute. Someone, quick, take a picture. We never thought we'd see you like this." The teasing was relentless. One by one, his teammates eagerly piled on, seizing the moment to poke fun at Lance. But Lance didn't mind. With grace, he accepted every jab. "Laugh all you want. I know you're all just jealous. But too bad, this kind of charm is unbeatable. Unless you're reincarnated, nothing's going to change that." A collective TSK followed as everyone burst into laughter. Finally, Clark, looking sheepish, approached Lance. "Sorry about earlier, Lance, watching Clark scratch his head awkwardly, couldn't help but burst out laughing. "No worries. I understand. Besides, let them laugh for now, they won't be laughing during training." Clark. A shiver ran down Clark's spine. What was this unsettling feeling? Was it just his imagination? Why did Lance's smile give off Hannibal Lecter vibes? Was this normal? Help. But Lance didn't elaborate. He simply turned around, ready to get back to the game. His light, energetic steps showed that he couldn't wait to start. Poor Mississippi State. As it turned out, they really were in for a rough time. Lance was in top form, performing spectacularly. There was no sign of fatigue from last week's tough game. The recovery training had done wonders, and from the start, Lance was on fire. In the first half alone, Lance racked up 186 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns, utterly demolishing Mississippi State's ground defense. If he'd wanted, Lance could have easily padded his stats, surpassing 200 rushing yards without breaking a sweat. But Alabama didn't push for more. Lance clocked out early. In the second half, Jacobs and Clark took over ground duties, and the Crimson Tide continued to dominate, eliminating any suspense. The final score, 63-3. The Crimson Tide crushed Mississippi State at home, extending their unbeaten streak for the season. After the game, reporters were eager to interview Lance, but they quickly realized that all access had been cut off. Sabin had issued a media blackout, starting from this game. The Crimson Tide would not entertain any pregame or postgame interviews. Reporters were stunned. How could they keep their storylines going now? However, one reporter managed to shout a question at Lance through a gap in the fence. "Lance, Jackson said he's going to beat you, both in the national championship and for the Heisman." Lance gave a dazzling smile. "Good luck, Lammy." And with that, nothing more. The reporters could only watch as Lance walked off, powerless to do anything. At the post-game press conference, the reporters protested to Sabin, but he didn't care. He simply reiterated that no players would be available for interviews. All interviews would be conducted at official press conferences, where Sabin would respond on their behalf. The reporters were left with no options. In the NFL, this would have violated league rules, as players are required to attend post-game press conferences, with specific time requirements. But in the NCAA, no such rules existed. Frustrated, the reporters had no choice but to turn their attention elsewhere, particularly toward Jackson. Why Jackson? Because the media loves to target the frontrunner, and with Jackson leading the Heisman race, he was the obvious choice. Meanwhile, Watson had been flying under the radar most of the season. The Louisville Cardinals were desperate for a victory to stop their downward spiral and get back in the championship race. Not just any win, a statement win. Jackson, too, needed to silence the doubters. But instead, Louisville lost. Chapter 118, Dramatic Turn of Events. 41-38, beep. 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 The game was over, and the visiting Kentucky Wildcats clinched a last-second field goal to defeat their longtime rivals, the Louisville Cardinals, taking home the victory. The game was a roller coaster, full of ups and downs, but in the end, Louisville suffered their second consecutive heartbreaking loss, both in the final moments. Ah. Oh. The Kentucky Wildcats players went wild, completely wild, shouting, jumping, and roaring in celebration without restraint. Meanwhile, Lamar Jackson's knees buckled as he dropped to the ground. What just happened? How did they lose? Not only had they lost 2 consecutive games, but they'd also fallen to unranked teams 2 weeks in a row. His mind was blank, a dull buzzing filling his head, and his thoughts stretched thin, with countless questions swirling around. After the game, the statistics comparison was clear. Kentucky Wildcats quarterback Stephen Johnson completed 16 of 27 passes for 338 yards, throwing 3 touchdown passes with 1 interception. Louisville's Lamar Jackson, on the other hand, completed 16 of 25 passes for 281 yards and ran the ball 25 times for 171 yards, scoring 2 passing touchdowns and 2 rushing touchdowns but also throwing 3 interceptions. The answer was obvious. Jackson was both their hero and their downfall. Throughout the game, Jackson tried to prove himself, going full throttle with both his passing and running game, attempting 25 passes and 25 runs. However, his passing yards fell short compared to the lesser-known Johnson, mainly due to his inaccurate long throws. Reckless decisions and poor passing mechanics led to 3 interceptions, turning over the ball and undoing all of Louisville's efforts. Yet no one could blame Jackson. This was just the way Louisville played, victory or defeat always rested squarely on his shoulders. One stat was particularly telling: Jackson led his team in both passing and rushing yards, while not a single wide receiver, tight end, or running back on the Cardinals managed to break 100 yards. At the start of the season, this strategy worked, and Jackson basked in the spotlight, receiving all the praise. But as the season wore on, this same strategy hit a wall, and now Jackson alone was left to bear all the pressure and criticism. So, was it all Lance's fault? Jackson was baffled. How had his brilliant season been thrown off course by a running back? This wasn't how things were supposed to go. After Louisville's shocking loss to Kentucky, the NCAA landscape shifted dramatically. First, the Heisman Trophy odds saw a shakeup for the second consecutive week. Lance rose to the top, continuing his season-long upward momentum. This was the first time all season that Lance was leading the Heisman race. Jackson fell to second place, and Watson held steady in third. Though Louisville had lost, Jackson's dual-threat performance, passing and rushing, hadn't gone unnoticed. Many analysts still believed Jackson's play was better than Watson's, which is why Watson hadn't overtaken him, even after Clemson's victory. However, the odds between the 3 players were razor-thin, and the race for the Heisman remained shrouded in mystery. This year's Heisman Trophy race was the most intriguing in years, with history guaranteed to be made no matter the outcome. If Jackson won, he'd become Louisville's first-ever Heisman Trophy winner. If Watson won, he'd become Clemson's first-ever Heisman Trophy winner. If Lance won, not only would it be the first time since 1974-75 that a running back had won the Heisman in consecutive years, following Ohio State's Archie Griffin, it would also mark the first time ever that the same school had claimed the Heisman Trophy 2 years in a row. Moreover, Lance would be the first ever Asian American Heisman winner. Any result would be groundbreaking and would etch a new chapter in history. As the season's final games approached, each result had the potential to upend the standings. The drama was as intense as an Olympic 100-meter final. Secondly, with the regular season drawing to a close, the final rankings, conference championships, bowl game matchups, and the national championship were all coming into focus. Coach Sabin had predicted this: in a league as competitive as the NCAA, one game could turn everything upside down, completely altering the bowl game outlook. With the season nearing its conclusion, Louisville's back-to-back defeats in what should have been easy wins caused them to plummet. Just 2 weeks ago, they were ranked 3rd in the NCAA, now, they had fallen to 15th, a freefall. This meant Louisville's chances of making it to the national championship were slipping away. At the very least, the fate of the Cardinals was no longer in their hands. Everything had changed. Just 2 weeks earlier, Louisville was a championship favorite, and now they had lost control of their destiny. The emotional whiplash from being so close to glory to now having only a slim chance of even reaching the national championship couldn't begin to describe what Jackson was feeling. Of course, the season wasn't over yet. There were still 2 games to play, and each victory could rewrite the standings. Louisville couldn't give up hope, they needed to win both remaining games just to keep their dream alive. Once again, all eyes turned to Jackson. But as Jackson knelt on the field, he wasn't thinking about anyone else. His mind was filled with just one name, Lance. What would Lance say about this? During the post-game interviews, when Jackson heard that Lance had clenched his fist and cheered him on, he nearly spat out blood. His eyes blazed with anger. Humiliation. Pure humiliation. While Jackson was completely wrapped up in the media frenzy, with his thoughts consumed by Lance, things were different for the Crimson Tide. Thanks to Sabin's decisive leadership, the media storm and distractions were kept firmly outside the Crimson Tide's walls, allowing the team to focus. Clearly, Lance had no room in his mind for Jackson or the Louisville Cardinals. He didn't care about Jackson or their situation. His focus was purely on the next game, taking it one step at a time, giving everything he had. What Jackson, Watson, or the Heisman Trophy voters thought didn't matter. The entire Crimson Tide team was united in their mission, charging ahead. In Week 11, Alabama faced the 13th-ranked Chattanooga Mocs and kept their momentum going with a 31-3 win. In Week 12, the regular season finale, Alabama faced not just any opponent, but a matchup that was among the most highly anticipated and talked about games of the entire season. It wasn't just about preserving their undefeated record but also the prestige of their historic rivalry. Their opponent? The Auburn Tigers. Yes, yet another team with a tiger mascot. This game wasn't just any game, it was the Iron Bowl, one of the most storied rivalries in the history of the Southeastern Conference and all of college football. Chapter 119, not worth mentioning. Auburn University and the University of Alabama, both located in the state of Alabama, are two powerhouse NCAA teams with deeply rooted fan bases, mainly because the state doesn't have an NFL team. These two traditional rivals have long dominated the hearts of Alabama's football fans. Naturally, the teams meet every year, sometimes more than once. Initially, their matches took place in Birmingham, Alabama, a city once comparable to Pittsburgh as a steel manufacturing hub during the early 20th century. This is the origin of the name Iron Bowl. As of 2016, the two teams had clashed 80 times, with Alabama's Crimson Tide holding a narrow lead of 44 wins, 35 losses, and 1 tie. Now, the 81st Iron Bowl was about to begin. The Iron Bowl isn't just steeped in history, it's known for its countless high-stakes battles, controversies, and long-standing grudges. In recent years, the Iron Bowl has only grown more intense. The 2010 Iron Bowl. The Crimson Tide led 24-0 at home, but Auburn's Heisman-winning quarterback, Cam Newton, led a historic comeback, ultimately winning 28-27 at Bryant-Denny Stadium, securing an undefeated season and the SEC championship. After the game, Auburn fans draped Cam Newton's jersey over the statue of legendary Alabama coach Paul "Bear" Bryant, located at the entrance of Bryant-Denny Stadium, infuriating Crimson Tide fans. In retaliation, Alabama fans poisoned Auburn's famous oak tree on campus. To this day, fans of both teams continue to argue over these infamous actions. The 2013 Iron Bowl. With 1 second left in regulation, the teams were tied 28-28. Alabama freshman kicker Adam Griffith lined up for a 57-yard field goal to win the game. The kick fell just short, missing the goal by barely 2 yards, skimming past the post. Auburn's cornerback Chris Davis, waiting in the end zone, skillfully positioned himself, caught the ball on the goal line, and began a return. Davis weaved through the field, completing an improbable 109-yard return for a touchdown. Auburn won the game, 34-28. That game later won the ESPY Award for Best Game of the Year, competing against all other sports and games globally. Following the 2010 Iron Bowl, Alabama won the next 2 matchups. After the 2013 Iron Bowl, Alabama again won the next 2 meetings, solidifying their dominance in the Nick Sabin era. Despite this, Auburn fans still reveled in their 2010 and 2013 victories, as those 2 dramatic wins gave them ample material to taunt their rivals. This year would be no different. Alabama entered the game as the top-ranked team in the NCAA, chasing a perfect season. Auburn, on the other hand, was ranked 13th. Despite the disparity in rosters, talent, and form, Auburn's players believed they could upset their rivals in this heated grudge match. Auburn's junior quarterback, Shaun White, who redshirted the previous year, was not considered elite within the SEC. But this was the Iron Bowl, and the sight of the Crimson Tide always seemed to light a fire under Auburn players, who couldn't wait to trash talk. They're nothing. I'm not exaggerating, their so-called Chinese running back is garbage. We'll show him what real, professional-level defense is. Those clowns better get ready. They'll act all tough in the first half, only to collapse after halftime. They'll melt like butter, we'll come back and beat them, and they'll be left crying and making excuses. Look at the pattern, it's been 3 years. It's time again. White was full of swagger. 2010, 2013, and now 2016. The cycle was clear, 3 years apart, Alabama was poised to win, only to be upset by Auburn. The previous 2 meetings had seen the Crimson Tide in control, only to be shockingly overturned by the Tigers. This year, Alabama was overwhelmingly favored to win, but Auburn believed they were ready for another 3-year cycle upset, ready to send Alabama crashing back to earth. Their rivals' misery was their happiness. It wasn't just Sean White, Auburn's entire team displayed unshakable confidence, including their head coach, Gus Malzahn. Football is a team sport, it's not as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. We found the key to victory, and the Auburn Tigers will have the last laugh. We are confident, we are capable, and we are prepared. The team was united in their belief. Before the game, the air was thick with tension. Unfortunately, because of Sabin's media restrictions, Alabama players weren't giving interviews. They were entirely unaware of Auburn's trash talk, so the war of words never got off the ground. Auburn's smack talk went unanswered, leaving them boasting to an empty room, with their trash talk echoing back to them in awkward silence. Stay tuned, we're going to give the Crimson Tide a real shock. Malzahn's bold words were delivered in pre-game interviews, while Sabin remained cool as ever. I'll be looking forward to that, Sabin said calmly. By the end of the game, Sabin was indeed surprised, but not in the way Auburn had hoped. Where had Malzahn's pre-game confidence come from? From R. Kelly? Did he believe he could fly? The 81st Iron Bowl ended with a resounding final score of 42-6, as the Crimson Tide cruised to an easy victory. The gap was evident. Since that fateful 2010 comeback win, Auburn had not won another game at Bryant-Denny Stadium. This game also marked the largest margin of victory in the Iron Bowl since 2012. In fact, if Sabin hadn't rested his key players for future championship games, rotating the starters in the third quarter and playing the reserves in the fourth, the score could have been even more lopsided, and Auburn might have been shut out completely. The game was a one-sided beatdown, with Alabama dominating both offense and defense, leaving their century-old rivals utterly humiliated. The more boastful Auburn was before the game, the more pitiful they looked during it. Sabin's strategy in the second half revealed his indifference. He didn't even care to humiliate Auburn, his focus had already shifted to more important championship games. Beating Auburn was not even a challenge. That was the real humiliation. Sean White, Auburn's quarterback, was practically invisible, completing just 15 of 32 passes for a measly 98 yards, with no touchdowns and 3 interceptions, a pitiful stat line. In stark contrast, Lance looked like he was taking a leisurely stroll in his backyard, rushing for 187 yards and scoring 2 touchdowns before clocking out early. Auburn couldn't stop Lance. In fact, they couldn't stop Jacobs or Clark either. So, in a game that felt as easy as cutting through butter, Alabama sealed the victory in the Iron Bowl, finishing the season undefeated with a 12-0 record and maintaining their number 1 ranking in the NCAA. Chapter 120, Absolute Domination. In 2016, the NCAA regular season had officially come to an end, but the real show was just beginning. Unlike the NFL, the NCAA is divided into many conferences, so the postseason unfolds in 2 stages. Stage 1, the conference championships. Stage 2, the college football playoff for the national championship. The schedule is spread out. The first stage begins immediately after the regular season, typically held during the first week of December. Then comes a 3-week break, coinciding with final exams for university students. The second stage kicks off after the Christmas holiday, with teams returning for the national championship competition. First up is the conference championships. The Southeastern Conference, SEC, is divided into 2 divisions. The Eastern Division and the Southern Division. Regardless of each team's overall record, the division champions from both the East and South face off in the SEC championship game. This year, the Eastern Division champion is the University of Florida, with a 9-3 record, and the Southern Division champion is Alabama, having gone undefeated. Both teams are set to meet in the SEC championship game. For Alabama, this marks their third consecutive SEC championship appearance and their second undefeated season under head coach Nick Sabin since the 2009 season. Naturally, as the top seed in the NCAA, the Crimson Tide is favored to win. However, the University of Florida is not to be underestimated. This is a team without standout stars, relying on collective team strength to win games. They are known for their defensive prowess and consistency. While Florida hasn't cracked the top 10 rankings, fluctuating around 20th place throughout the season, they've proven to be a solid team with few weaknesses. In short, they shouldn't be taken lightly. Indeed, the University of Florida had prepared thoroughly. Inspired by the game where LSU nearly upset Alabama, Florida focused on neutralizing Lance by targeting the run game and applying pressure on the line of scrimmage. It was clear that Florida had carefully studied game tapes and had a specific plan to contain Alabama. Despite their humble approach, they had their sights set on winning the SEC championship. But the Crimson Tide had also come prepared. Not only Sabin, but the entire offensive unit had learned from previous challenges and grown throughout the season. This time, they were much more composed in the face of Florida's defensive strategy. Lance played the role of decoy, drawing the defense's attention to the front lines, while Jalen Hurts finally showcased his quarterback skills with a strong passing attack. Alabama's passing game, which had been overlooked and underestimated throughout the season, caught Florida off guard. However, Florida's secondary defense was commendable. Their cornerbacks and safeties coordinated well, giving them moments of respite amid Alabama's offensive onslaught. But as soon as they took a breather, they lost focus on their run defense, and Alabama capitalized. Lance again. On one particular run, starting from 5 yards out, Lance seemed to be taken down by a tackle. Yet, just before hitting the ground, he miraculously broke free, regained his footing, and extended the run into a 17-yard touchdown. Florida's defense was clearly frustrated. They found themselves torn between defending against the pass and the run, and as a result, they struggled to contain either. On the other side, Florida's offense lacked the firepower to keep up. Once they fell behind, they never managed to recover. In the end, 63-14. Alabama's Crimson Tide secured a comfortable home victory, claiming the SEC championship. Under Nick Sabin, Alabama remained the undisputed powerhouse of the SEC. Even with last season's key players like Derrick Henry having moved on to the NFL, the Tide's roster of young talent continued to dominate, maintaining their control over the conference. Terrifying dominance. There's no denying that Sabin has built a legacy that will be difficult to surpass in the NCAA. With the conference championships concluded, teams now had 3 weeks to rest and prepare before stepping onto the national stage. The battle for the college football playoff was about to begin, and all eyes were on the 2016 national championship. Alabama's goal remained unchanged, to bring home the national title. However, before the players could shift their focus to the national championship, they first had to return to being students and prepare for their final exams. This academic challenge was a different kind of battlefield, one that required mental endurance. Luckily, Alabama's team had a new, dual-threat student athlete this year. Thanks to Lance's help, his teammates were much more confident and prepared for their exams. After the long hours of studying and taking finals, the players finally received their grades and headed home for the holidays, ready to celebrate Christmas. Creak. Coach Burns pushed open the door to the locker room, smiling at the sight of his young players laughing and joking around. This was the last practice session before the Christmas break, so the team was doing some light training. The mood was cheerful, and their youthful energy filled the room. Burns couldn't help but smile. Ahem. After a couple of coughs, the room fell silent as the players turned to face the door. Coach Burns, came the chorus of greetings, bringing a wider smile to Burns' face. Remember to watch your diet during the holidays. Don't come back out of shape. We don't have time to get you back on track once you return. We've still got 2 championships waiting for us. The locker room erupted in laughter. Yes, sir. We got it, Coach. Don't worry about us. Burns chuckled along with them before scanning the room for someone in particular. "Lance, come with me for a moment." Immediately. "Ho, ho, ho. Lance. Lance. Lance." The locker room filled with teasing cheers as the team erupted in good-natured fun. Lance didn't mind at all, smiling as he spread his arms wide, embracing the cheers like a movie star on a red carpet, basking in the applause. The locker room was alive with noise. As Lance left, the rest of the team returned to their usual banter and roughhousing. Clark, curious, asked, "Why is Coach Burns calling for Lance right now?" Jacobs shook his head. "Not sure, probably something to do with his training program." Clark nodded in agreement. "Makes sense. Lance hasn't had any formal training before this. He probably doesn't know how to plan his workouts during the break." Thinking ahead to their return after Christmas and the upcoming bowl games, Clark's excitement grew. "I wonder who we'll face in the bowl game." Meanwhile, Lance was also curious about why Burns had called for him. He had a suspicion that it might have something to do with the agreement they had made at the start of the season. Could it be that the head coach was now ready to assess his progress? To his surprise, Burns didn't lead him to the principal's office but instead brought him to the head coach's office. Burns offered Lance a reassuring smile, knocked on the door, and entered without waiting for a response. Inside, Coach Sabin was sitting at his desk, watching game footage. Chapter 121, Genuine Care. The office was clean, organized, and bright, just like the impression Coach Sabin gave off. Everything in the room was in perfect order. Behind his desk, a large bookshelf was packed tightly, but instead of books, it was filled with game tapes. Along the wall, there was another smaller shelf. On it sat numerous dark blue binders, each neatly labeled. The labels dated back to 2015, with earlier years listed as well. Sabin noticed Lance's gaze and glanced at the shelf. "Those are tactical playbooks from over the years. Not just ours, but also from other NCAA teams and some NFL teams," he explained. Tactical playbooks are crucial in football. NFL teams guard them closely. Every year, a new playbook is issued to prevent players who transfer from exposing old plays. However, after 5 years, these playbooks become available to the public. This shelf only holds a small part of my collection. "Wow," Lance thought, impressed. Sabin gave a slight smile and motioned toward a chair. "Sit." Lance pulled his eyes away from the shelf and noticed Coach Burns was already seated next to him. If it weren't for Burns' friendly expression, the setup might have seemed a bit too formal. Sabin spoke calmly, "Relax, you're not in trouble. We're not here to scold you today." It was rare for the usually serious Sabin to crack a joke. Lance let out an exaggerated sigh of relief. "Well, that's good to know." Though Sabin didn't respond with another joke, the tension in the room eased. Sabin, not one to joke much, returned to the matter at hand. "The reason we called you here today, with Coach Burns present, is to discuss your situation. We all know your joining the football team this season was unexpected. Coach Burns practically had to drag you onto the team, and you weren't exactly willing." Lance chuckled awkwardly. "Coach." Sabin waved it off. "No need to be embarrassed, that's just the truth. But I don't regret it. In fact, I should thank Coach Burns, and I should also thank you for helping us out when we needed it most. Initially, we just hoped you could help us transition for a bit, but it turns out we struck gold." Coach Burns chimed in for once. "Lance, thank you. Now Coach Sabin owes me a Christmas drink." Sabin nodded, "Fair enough. I'll make sure you're swimming in it." Burns grinned, clearly pleased. Turning back to Lance, Sabin continued, "I know you had an agreement with the school principal. Today, I wanted to let you know there's no need to wait until the end of the season. We've already informed the principal that you've met the requirements. The principal also informed us that the legal issues have been settled. The school and the injured student reached an out-of-court settlement, and the lawsuit has been dropped." Although Lance had expected this, hearing the confirmation brought a sense of relief. That looming threat was finally off his shoulders. Lance paused for a moment. "What about the agreement between Coach Burns and the principal?" Sabin froze. Burns looked surprised. "How do you know about that?" Lance shrugged casually. Coach, the principal isn't exactly known for being charitable. Burns opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. Eventually, a small smile crept onto his face. Sabin, with a touch of admiration in his eyes, added, "You don't need to worry about Coach Burns. I, Nick Sabin, have enough influence to ensure he stays here." It was a subtle reminder of Sabin's undeniable power within the NCAA. But, Sabin continued, the agreement between Burns and the principal has already been fulfilled, far beyond expectations, actually. Burns had agreed that at least 7 of Alabama's games this season would be broadcast nationwide. However, without even waiting for the bowl games or the national championship, the Crimson Tide had already exceeded that goal. This season, 9 of their 12 regular season games were nationally televised. Adding the SEC championship game, that number reached 10. Alabama's dominant performance had once again made them the standout team in college football, and they had easily secured the most national broadcasts of any team in the NCAA. Not just within the SEC, but across the entire NCAA, Alabama's influence was at the very top. Burns looked at Lance, a proud smile on his face. Piece of cake. Lance finally cracked a smile. Sabin wasn't done yet. That's one thing. Now, onto another important matter. The serious discussion was about to begin. Lance hadn't expected this, but he sat up a little straighter, ready to listen. Sabin gave Lance an approving look. Despite Lance's laid-back, joking nature, when it came to serious matters, he was always focused. To Sabin, Lance was the smartest player on the team. This season, Lance's presence had made the team's tactical training smoother and more efficient. Even team leaders like Allen and Foster respected Lance, and that had been crucial in shaping the team's attitude this season. Sabin motioned for Lance to relax and got straight to the point. "We know that your switch to football was purely accidental. Before this, you had no knowledge of the game or any idea what it was about. But after observing you for these past 6 months, both Coach Burns and I believe you have a natural aptitude for football. You have the potential to reach heights others can only dream of. The Crimson Tide is always in the spotlight, not just in the NCAA but also with the pros. I'm sure you've already been approached by agents." Coach Burns jumped in, curious. "But no team has contacted you yet, right?" Lance shook his head. Sabin wasn't surprised. Teams don't need to rush. The Jacksonville Jaguars have been putting out feelers every week, thinking they're being clever, but everyone's already caught on. It's pretty clear they have their sights set on you." Burns laughed, "That's about all the tricks they've got. Still, the Jaguars wouldn't be a bad choice. Their record might not be great, but they'd treat you well. You'd have more opportunities to shine, and the contract wouldn't be bad either." The conversation hadn't even fully started, and Burns was already worrying about Lance's future. Sabin called out, "Burton." Burns realized he was getting ahead of himself and gave Lance a reassuring smile. Sabin resumed. "What Coach Burns means is that if you want to, you could go pro right now." Burns, trying to steer the conversation back on track, quickly added, "The reason we called you here is to ask about your plans. Do you want to keep playing football? Are you considering turning pro?" Sabin glanced at Burns. "Since we were the ones who pulled you onto this ship, there's not much we can do for you, but we at least owe you some responsibility." Burns, a bit embarrassed, scratched his head. "Coach, I just think we shouldn't let such a talent slip away." Sabin gave a faint smile. "You're saying all this with the men sitting right here." Burns grinned sheepishly at Lance, who couldn't help but joke, "Coach, I can confirm that Coach Burns didn't kidnap me. At least, he didn't put a knife to my throat." Chapter 122, Thoughtful Advice. "Coach, I can confirm that Coach Burns didn't kidnap me, at least not with a knife to my throat," Lance joked. Unexpectedly, Burns turned to Sabin with a smug look on his face, rocking his head back and forth, muttering proudly, See. Lance said it himself. Sabin shook his head slightly in exasperation. "Talk about self-praise. You really don't miss a beat." Burns glanced down at his chubby belly in acknowledgement. Laughter filled the room, and the mood instantly lightened. Through all the banter, Lance could sense genuine care from both Sabin and Burns. They were sincerely looking out for his best interests. After a bit of lightheartedness, Sabin quickly steered the conversation back on track. "Lance. If you're not interested in pursuing football or going pro, it's time to start planning for your senior year and your future. Football isn't the only path in life. I've reviewed your academic performance, and I think you do very well in the journalism field. I know some people in the newspaper and TV industry. If you're interested, I can make some calls and arrange internships. You could even start in New York. There are plenty of opportunities for growth there. But if you do want to keep playing football, then we also need to start planning. Even though you've only been playing for a year, you're already a junior. The question of when to enter the draft is now a very real one. To be honest, Coach Burns and I would love to keep you for another year, but we don't want to be selfish. Sabin paused, and Burns nodded in agreement before picking up where Sabin left off. Objectively speaking, if you stayed another year, the room for growth would be limited. Your talent, your intelligence, your skills, they're all well prepared. Of course, if you entered the NFL now, I won't lie, it's going to be tough. The intensity of the competition is something you're not fully ready for yet. As the season progresses, that gap will become more apparent, and if you're not careful, your risk of injury will increase. But all things considered, you're a player who thrives under challenges and pressure. We've seen your growth and transformation over these months. You're constantly learning, studying both offense and defense. Honestly, your understanding of football has already surpassed most of the team. That's why, after many discussions, we believe that it's better for you to enter the pros next year. There's no need to waste any more time. Lance, you must know that the career span of a running back is relatively short. If you enter the NFL, you'll face challenges from the start. You'll also need to think long-term. We all want to see you continue to succeed at the professional level, so. Burns glanced at Sabin, his expression conflicted. As the running backs coach, Burns wasn't happy with the current state of the league. He despised the way running backs were treated, undervalued, overworked. He sympathized with their struggles, but as a small-time coach, what could he do to change things? Burns was torn. On one hand, he sincerely wanted Lance to enter the NFL. He believed in Lance and thought he might be one of the few who could bring something new and exciting to the position of running back. On the other hand, he regretted dragging Lance into football, training him as a running back, a position that seemed to have no future. In the end, Burns couldn't continue speaking. Sabin understood, completely. So, he picked up the conversation. If you decide to continue with football and enter the draft next year, we'll need to help you prepare. Before you head to the rookie training camps, both Coach Burns and I believe you should undergo some additional training. Strength and endurance are important, but so is updating your understanding of tactics and strategy. Whether it's for the draft or your future professional career, preparation is key. They were genuinely concerned, considering every aspect of Lance's future. In truth, the Crimson Tide had just gone through the pain of losing their star running back to the NFL last year. Lance had been their saving grace this season. From the perspective of the coaching staff and the Crimson Tide's interests, they should have been doing everything they could to convince Lance to stay. That would have been the logical thing to do. But they weren't. Indeed, the NCAA is a league full of controversy. Every year, it generates massive profits, but none of that money goes to the players. Sure, these students get scholarships and a free education, but when compared to the NCAA's earnings, it's a drop in the bucket. Meanwhile, some self-serving coaches try everything to keep their players from going pro, squeezing every last bit of value out of them. But Sabin and Burns weren't like that. It was clear they genuinely saw Lance as a talent and truly wanted him to have a bright future. Perhaps deep down, they both simply loved the game of football. Sabin wasn't done speaking. The reason we wanted to talk to you today is so you can go home for Christmas and discuss everything with your parents. There's no rush to decide. Talk it over with your family, think it through calmly. Things may not be going exactly as we planned, but that's okay. There's still time. Whatever decision you make, it's important that it aligns with what you truly want. Genuine care. Looking at the two coaches before him, Lance felt a warmth in his heart. Coach, if I do go pro, what about the team? Sabin smiled slightly. Don't worry. Jacobs has already stepped up. Next year, he'll be ready to take on the starting running back role. Burns added, and the other injured running backs will be back too. Thanks to you, Coach Sabin and I are even thinking of redshirting some of them so they don't waste a year. Next season, they'll have to work even harder. After Derek, now you, they'll need to work to keep the Crimson Tide's tradition of great running backs alive. Sabin nodded in agreement. Plus, we'll have a new batch of recruits coming in. College football doesn't stop. Every year, players graduate, new players come in. We're used to it. It's just the nature of our job. Lance, remember, in both the NFL and NCAA, team interests always come before individual interests. You shouldn't sacrifice yourself for the team if it's not in your best interest. It's unnecessary, and it's not worth it. If a team expects you to make sacrifices, they need to show enough sincerity first. They need to sacrifice for you before they can ask the same of you. Otherwise, never trust what a team manager promises you. Got it? So, don't worry about the team. Focus on your future. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to ask me. All right, the two of us old guys have bothered you long enough. Go on, enjoy your holiday and don't forget to send my regards to your parents. Chapter 123, Christmas Break. Ding. The door of the Lee family restaurant opened, and the sound of a bell echoed. A cheerful voice greeted the new arrival. Welcome. How many in your party? Do you have a reservation? Just one, no reservation. How long is the wait? About 30 minutes. If you're in a hurry, we offer takeout as well. Sue, who had been focused on the cash register, finally looked up from her work. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead from the rush of customers, but her friendly smile stayed in place. At a glance, she gave off a warm and inviting impression. But suddenly, her smile faltered, and her eyes filled with surprise and disbelief. In the next moment, joy and happiness replaced her shock, lighting up her face. Lance. How did you get here so early? Didn't you say your flight was landing at 4 p.m.? Your dad and I were planning to pick you up at the airport. How did you get here on your own? Standing before her was Lance, her son. Clearly, Sue hadn't been prepared for his early arrival, seeing her son's face hours earlier than expected. She quickly stepped from behind the counter, happily standing before him, grabbing his hands, and taking him in from head to toe. Her gaze settled on his face, and with so much to say, it all came out in just one word. You've lost weight. Lance chuckled. It was true, parents everywhere seemed to be the same. Though Lance had actually gained weight in his time with the team, in his parents' eyes, he looked thinner. He didn't argue. The restaurant is busy, so let me help out first. Sue held on to him. We've always managed, even when it was busier than this. We don't need an extra hand right now. Go and rest. Lance sighed with a smile. Mom, if we just stand here like this, the customers are going to think I'm here to collect protection money or something. I'm not that fragile. You handle the cash, I'll take the orders. He handed her his bag and scanned the crowded restaurant, immediately moving toward a table that hadn't ordered yet. Sue watched him go, feeling both proud and amused. She glanced at the small, light bag in her hands, realizing he had no luggage with him. You traveled with just this? Lance didn't answer, already moving through the restaurant. Shaking her head, Sue muttered under her breath, this child. Lance's parents were first-generation immigrants who had come to New York in the early 1990s. They started from nothing, working small jobs like construction, laundry, and street vending until they earned enough to open a small restaurant in Chinatown. Step by step, Lance's father, Alan, and mother, Sue, finally gained a foothold in a foreign land. The restaurant started running smoothly, and they even managed to buy a small apartment in downtown Manhattan, not big, just a cozy 50-square-meter home. But it was theirs, a place to call home. Even now, the couple led simple, thrifty lives. Alan personally manned the kitchen while Sue handled the cash register. They only had one employee to help with the waitstaff, and they continued saving, hoping to one day afford a larger home. But in Manhattan, where real estate prices were sky-high, it wasn't easy. Lance was their only child. When Lance had first transmigrated into this world, he'd kept some distance from his parents. After all, he wasn't the original Lance, and maintaining a bit of space felt like the right thing to do. But Alan and Sue kept sending him texts and calling him, never about anything important, just the usual everyday things. Ignoring them seemed strange, so slowly, the distance between them closed. Reflecting on it now, Lance realized that without his parents' support, he would never have been able to pursue mixed martial arts growing up. When Lance was young, he was often sick and weak. His father had enrolled him in Wing Chun classes, hoping it would improve his health. To their surprise, Lance fell in love with martial arts. It wasn't just Wing Chun, he eventually dabbled in various forms of martial arts before moving on to mixed martial arts training. Even though Alan and Sue had hopes for their son's future, seeing him healthy and genuinely passionate about something was enough for them. Moreover, Lance had always been responsible with his studies, maybe not a child prodigy, but certainly one they never had to worry about. So, they supported him, and Lance stuck with it. Little could they have imagined that their once frail child would grow into a strong football star. The first reunion of this Christmas break wasn't awkward or strained as Lance had feared. The moment he stepped into the restaurant, the familiar, comfortable atmosphere of home enveloped him, and the busy routine of the restaurant felt like muscle memory. Ding! Hey, Chef Lee. Orders for tables 5 and 7, plus some additional orders for tables 14 and 17. Also, check the special requests. A voice called out from the kitchen's serving window. Alan responded with a quick, "Got it," before realizing he had replied in Chinese. He looked up instinctively and was stunned to see Lance's smiling face. "When did you get here?" Lance laughed. "The customers are waiting. There's a line out the door. Keep up the hard work, Chef Lee." Alan immediately caught the playful tone in Lance's words, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He pretended to be stern, "Just don't break the customer's arms with those clumsy hands of yours." Lance burst into laughter and went back to attending tables. Life, Lance thought, is truly strange. Not too long ago, he'd been on the field at Bryant-Denny Stadium, in the thick of the Crimson Tide's battles, the roar of the crowd ringing in his ears as if the whole world were at his feet. Today, he was back in his family's small restaurant, dutifully running food to tables, not as the Crimson Tide's number 23, but as a waiter at Lee Family Restaurant. No applause, no cheers, just the grounded reality of daily life. If anyone thought that training as a football player was tough and running food in a restaurant was easy, they'd be wrong. The hustle and exhaustion from a lunch rush in a busy restaurant could leave you sore and tired in ways even football didn't. The lunch rush finally ended around 2 o'clock. The last table left, and they flipped the closed sign. The family of 3, along with their one employee, Jake Perry, finally sat down for their meal. Jake was a 20-year-old student at New York University who had started working at the restaurant in October to help pay for school. This was his first time meeting Lance. Earlier, Lance had exchanged a quick greeting with Jake, but they hadn't had time to chat since the restaurant was so busy. Now that they were sitting down, Lance figured it was a good chance to get to know him. Jake glanced at Lance's face, studying him closely. Unable to contain his curiosity, he looked again, scratching his head with a puzzled expression. Lance smiled and joked, "What? Do I not look like my parents?" Jake chuckled awkwardly. No, it's just, you remind me of someone famous." "No, that's probably not right. I must be mistaken." Just then, Sue approached. "What are you two chatting about?" Jake scratched his head again. "Well, your son kind of looks like this famous football player, the star running back from the Alabama Crimson Tide." "Haha, but it's probably just my mistake." "Ah, could it be?" Chapter 124, Being Open and Honest. "Ah." Lance blinked in confusion, wondering if he had heard correctly. Jake didn't notice Lance's reaction and instead flashed a big grin, turning towards Sue as she approached. "A running back is a position in football. It's really cool and strong. Even though the league doesn't focus on them much now, I still think running backs are the essence and soul of football, its most primal element." As Jake kept talking, he scratched his head. "Ah, but you guys probably aren't that interested." "Sorry." Sue waved it off, setting a bowl of beef stew on the table. "Alabama University. My son goes there. You could ask him if he knows who you're talking about." Jake's eyes widened as he turned toward Lance. "You go to Alabama too?" Taking a closer look at Lance, Jake suddenly covered his mouth in shock. Lance gave a sheepish smile. "Nice to meet you. Thanks for watching my games." Jake froze, a chill running up his spine and spreading to his head, leaving him paralyzed with shock. Jesus Christ! Just then, Alan came out of the kitchen, carrying 2 plates of stir-fried dishes. Just a simple lunch for now, and we'll prepare a big dinner later. Seeing Jake's stunned expression, Alan was puzzled. What's up, Jake? What did you see? Lance had been thinking about how to talk to his parents about football, and now the opportunity had presented itself. He figured he might as well be straightforward. I play football at school. There are televised games, and Jake seems to have recognized me. Lance said casually. Alan nodded in realization and looked at Jake. Oh, that extracurricular activity of his, huh? So those games get broadcast nationwide. Back in the spring, when Lance joined the football team, he hadn't wanted his parents to worry. Unsure of how to explain the situation, he'd briefly mentioned that his coach had recruited him for some extracurricular football activities that he'd take part in during his free time outside of class. Alan and Sue didn't think much of it. When they heard football, they thought it was soccer, so they didn't ask for more details. At that moment, Jake's face looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Extracurricular activity. He couldn't believe his ears. No, Lance is the best running back in college football right now. He's number one in the whole country. Sue smiled proudly at Lance and teased him, wow, number 1 in the country. So, do you have a certificate to show for that? Jake, jaw unhinged, heart stopped. Oh, dear Lord, could someone please explain to Lance's parents how serious this is? Jake stared at Lance, completely lost and overwhelmed, his mind a swirling mess as he wondered if he was dreaming. At first, Lance had felt a bit nervous and unsure about how to bring it up. But now, seeing Jake's bewildered expression, he couldn't help but laugh, feeling more at ease. Then Lance turned to Alan and Sue, waiting for them to sit down. Well, here's the deal. This semester, I've been playing for the university's football team, competing in the college league, you guys know about that. At first, I thought I was just helping out for a bit, but the coaches believe I have talent and am really suited for the sport. Now, they're suggesting I go pro and enter the draft in April. Lance kept his explanation short and straightforward. Jake gulped audibly, his mind going blank. He didn't know whether to be more shocked by how casually Lance described playing in the NCAA as a mere extracurricular activity or by the news that Lance was preparing for the draft. There were so many bombshells to process, he didn't know where to start. Alan, who had been busy with something else, paused slightly. So, you're keeping up with your classes, right? Jake nearly fell out of his chair. Seriously, that's not the point here. Lance wasn't surprised, though. He nodded. Yes, my schoolwork is all on track. Sue, on the other hand, didn't seem particularly concerned. She clearly hadn't grasped the full picture yet as she stood by the table, serving rice. So, is this what Jake meant by number 1 in the country? Lance smiled. Well, we did win the Southeastern Conference Championship. Sue chuckled. You won the championship. We should celebrate that tonight. Alan, however, had picked up on something important. Wait a minute, you said you're going pro. Does that mean you're planning to become a professional athlete? Sue froze. What do you mean, professional athlete? Lance nodded, meeting Alan's gaze. Yes. The coaches want me to ask for your opinion on it. That's ridiculous, Alan's expression darkened. Wasn't this just an extracurricular thing? How did it turn into going pro? What about your studies? What about your career after college? You said you'd grown up and finally understood responsibility, but you're still a child. Do you even know what it means to be a professional athlete? Sure, professional athletes look all glamorous, but the training is grueling. Just because you've dabbled in mixed martial arts doesn't mean you understand how hard it really is. Those pro athletes are on a whole different level. Each one of them is a genius, a monster. Professional sports aren't something just anyone can enter. You need talent and have to work harder than you can imagine. And don't even get me started on injuries. One injury, and all your hard work goes down the drain. This path isn't easy. I thought you went to college to study hard and become a journalist. Now you're telling me you're going to throw that away and try to become a professional athlete. What about mixed martial arts? You're just going to give that up and start playing football. Do you think becoming a professional athlete is something that can happen just because you've been playing for half a year? People work their whole lives and still might not make it. Just because a few people praise you doesn't mean you're a genius. A flood of words burst from Alan, harsh and furious. Though his words were jumbled and driven by anger, his message was crystal clear. Alan was far from happy. Sue was stunned, finally beginning to understand what they were actually talking about. Instinctively, Sue defended her son. Why are you yelling? Lance is just asking for our opinion, he didn't say he's definitely going. Why are you getting all worked up? Alan glared at Sue. You always baby him. No matter what he says, you think it's fine. Spoiled children end up useless, and he's this way because of how you pamper him. Sue wouldn't back down. Spoil him. Lance has always been responsible and knows what he's doing. We never have to worry about him. At least listen to what he has to say before jumping to conclusions. Sue turned to Lance, concern evident in her eyes, though she tried to stay calm. She softened her tone and spoke slowly. Lance, explain what's going on. We're listening. There was a reflexive urge within Lance to push back and rebel, but he fought it. He knew he needed to keep calm and have a rational conversation. Having gone through experiences like transmigrating and dealing with an unpredictable system, Lance had gained a more logical and detached perspective on things. He understood that beneath Alan's fiery temper and harsh words was genuine concern for his son's future. For Alan and Sue, the idea of a stable, practical job was the right path in life. The world of professional sports felt distant and risky, like chasing an unrealistic dream. They were simply worried for Lance. This realization made Lance feel calmer, and his thoughts began to clear. Chapter 125, At a Crossroads. In fact, Lance's father wasn't wrong. No matter his emotions or tone, what he said was grounded in reality, solid reasoning. Lance, as someone who came from a sports background, couldn't deny that. The road to professional sports, which might seem glamorous on the surface, is actually full of thorns, fraught with challenges and obstacles. It takes 1 in a million to become a superstar. And on top of that, Lance was jumping from one sport to another, preparing to enter the professional level after less than a year of playing. It sounded like a fantasy. But everything was made possible because of the football training system. Lance didn't rush or panic. He calmly met his father's gaze, using his body language to demonstrate his conviction, and patiently waited for the tension in the air to settle. He wanted to make sure it wasn't anger or emotion speaking for them. Only then did he begin. I know how ridiculous this sounds. To be honest, at the beginning, I was just helping the coach fill in some gaps, occasionally playing as a substitute. None of us expected things to develop this way. I've come to genuinely love the sport. I think football is fascinating. Outside of my studies and daily training, I find myself training on my own, studying tactics, and watching game footage. The more I learn, the more fun it gets. It's like a whole new passion. And I enjoy playing. Every game makes me feel excited and alive. When I'm on the field, I thrive in that atmosphere and competition. Lance's father wanted to interject, but before he could, Sue cut in, let him finish. Lance smiled gratefully at his mother and continued. Not only do I enjoy it, but I'm also really good at it. Really? I'm doing great. It was rare for Lance to speak so highly of himself. Then he looked at Jake. Lance understood that relying solely on his own words wouldn't carry enough weight. He needed someone else's objective perspective. Jake, whose mind was still foggy and who had been trying to remain invisible, suddenly became the center of attention. Lance, his father, and his mother were all looking at him. A bit nervous, Jake swallowed but eventually gathered the courage to speak. It's true. This season, Lance has been the best running back in college football, truly outstanding. He's currently the frontrunner for the Heisman Trophy. Oh, and the Heisman is the highest honor in college football. It's not just for running backs, it's for the best player, and Lance is at the top of the list. Alabama's undefeated season. Lance is at the heart of that success. Brief, but powerful. Lance gave Jake a thumbs up as thanks before turning back to his father. Even if you don't believe Jake, you should trust the coaches. They're the ones telling me I should go pro, and they've asked me to seek your advice. Exhaling gently, Lance could feel the atmosphere easing slightly. While his parents hadn't been fully swayed yet, the tension had lessened. Still, they seemed confused and uncertain. Lance thought for a moment and then decided to approach it from a different angle. When you first left China for New York, it was the same. You didn't know English, and you didn't have specialized skills. You knew nothing about New York, didn't have any clear goals or direction. You'd only heard that this place held opportunities, so you crossed the ocean to chase a better life. These past years, you've built everything from scratch, step by step. You've gone from having nothing to making your dream a reality, and you're still working hard for it. You didn't know what awaited you when you first arrived, but you still embarked on that unknown journey. And now, I'm doing the same. I have an idea, a passion, and excitement. I don't know what the future holds, and I can't guarantee success, but the world of professional sports is filled with more opportunities than I can currently see. I'm looking forward to it. I'm happy about it, and I'm ready for the challenges that await. I'm eager to start this new journey. This feeling is the same as when you first set foot in New York, not without fear or uncertainty, but filled with joy and anticipation. As Lance spoke, it was sincere and clear. Gradually, his parents calmed down. This version of Lance was unfamiliar to them. The little boy they remembered had quietly grown up, and there was no longer any sense of impulsiveness or immaturity. He was rational and composed as he persuaded them, articulating his thoughts clearly and confidently. Sue's emotions were mixed, worry, joy, pride, all swirled within her, and her eyes grew misty. She quickly turned away to compose herself. Lance's father was taken aback, sitting in silence for a long time before finally letting out a long sigh. You understand what going pro means, right? It's not the same as before. It will be 10 times, 100 times harder. You can't slack off or make excuses. It's a real job, and you'll face countless challenges. Once you start, you can't give up, even if all your efforts don't pay off. You might be a star in college, but every player in the pros is a star or a talent. Not every college star can continue to shine in the pros. Are you truly prepared for that? His father's voice was filled with sincerity, layered with worry, concern, and a heavy sense of reality. Lance nodded, simple but firm. Lance's father studied him. Even though Lance hadn't spoken further, his eyes and expression said everything, and finally, his father was convinced. All right. I understand. I won't try to stop you, but I have one request. Give yourself another month to think about it seriously. Prove that this isn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. If, after a month, you still want to go forward, then do it. After a pause, his father added. Your mom and I don't have much, but we can promise you'll always have a meal to eat. If becoming a pro athlete doesn't work out, come back and take over the family restaurant. You won't starve. You're grown up now. If you want to go out into the world, then go for it. Simple words, no longer sharp but tinged with warmth, made Lance's nose tingle with emotion. He thought he wouldn't care, given that this body now housed a different soul. But in this moment, he could feel the connection, the warmth in his chest swelling. Lance didn't say much, but he nodded deeply. Sue, who had been sitting silently the whole time, sniffled, struggling to maintain her composure. She tried to smile to comfort Lance, but when she opened her mouth, her voice trembled. Take care of yourself. She took a deep breath. I don't know much about being a pro athlete, but I do know you need to stay healthy. Stay away from injuries. Mom doesn't care about championships. I just want you to stay healthy. That's the most important thing. As she spoke, her eyes reddened again. Embarrassed, she lowered her head and rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to hide her tears. Chapter 126, Introductory Lesson. As Lance's gaze fell on Sue, his nose tingled with emotion. For a long time, he had thought he should maintain some distance from Sue and Alan. After all, he was an adult now, and children eventually grow up to carve out their own place in the world. But seeing the scene before him, he was reminded of his own parents and the original Lance who had disappeared. No matter what, he was now Lance, and from now on, he would continue to live as Lance. When it came time to speak, it turned out to be easier than he had imagined. Mom, don't worry about me. I'll take care of myself. Sue wiped her eyes messily and straightened her back, looking at Lance again. How can I not worry? No matter how old you are, you'll always be a child in your mother's eyes. Worrying about you is my job, and it will be, even when I'm old. If you're ready, then go out and face the world bravely. I believe in you. No matter what happens, I'll always be here waiting for you." Her words were calm yet powerful, like a harbor silently watching over Lance. Lance nodded firmly. Sue smiled and beckoned everyone, "Come on, let's eat before everything gets cold." "Oh, Jake, you mentioned we could watch the game on TV." Jake was a little confused. The family in front of him, speaking a mix of English and Chinese, fired off a rapid exchange. He could only understand parts of it but realized that things might be more complicated than he thought. Trying to remain unnoticed, he quietly held his breath, feeling a bit guilty, thinking he might have stirred up a hornet's nest. He wanted to apologize but sensed the atmosphere wasn't right, so he swallowed his words. Then, suddenly, the conversation shifted toward him. Jake blinked in surprise and quickly nodded. "Yes, yes. You can catch the games coming up." Jake looked nervously at Lance, hoping for a sign. Should he keep going, or was this not the right moment? Lance chuckled, "Jake, just make sure to turn on the TV for the games, all right?" Jake nodded enthusiastically, visibly relaxing as he exhaled a sigh of relief. "But can you guys even understand football?" Lance asked, smiling. "Football? Why wouldn't we understand football?" Alan asked. "Not soccer. In America, soccer is football. What I'm talking about is football. What they call football here is a sport with an oval-shaped ball that you throw." "What? I've been in America for so many years, and this is the first I'm hearing about it." "Oh. I remember now," Sue interjected. "Honey, remember last time we saw a group of kids in the park tossing around a brown ball? We wondered what kind of sport that was." "That must have been football, right?" "Right, Mom. That was football," Lance confirmed. The chatter continued, and the atmosphere warmed up again. The Christmas holiday was still underway, and this year, New York had been covered in snow. The streets were blanketed in white, while Christmas carols echoed through every corner, filling the air with a festive spirit. But professional sports never stopped. The NFL had scheduled games on both Christmas Eve and Christmas Day this year. On Christmas Eve, Friday night, the Cincinnati Bengals faced off against the Houston Texans. On Christmas Day, Saturday, the Baltimore Ravens and Pittsburgh Steelers' historic rivalry took place in the afternoon, followed by the Denver Broncos and Kansas City Chiefs in the evening. For the first time ever, Lance spent Christmas at home with his parents, watching football and teaching them the basics of the game. The Steelers-Ravens matchup is always a legendary rivalry in the NFL, and over the years, it has produced countless classic moments. This year's Christmas showdown was no exception. The two defense-heavy teams engaged in a hard-fought battle, with the scoreline remaining tight until the last minute. The Steelers finally clinched victory with a game-winning pass touchdown in the dying seconds, defeating the Ravens at home. Final score, 27-31. With this win, the Steelers ended the Ravens' 4-game winning streak and eliminated Baltimore's chances of making the playoffs, bringing their season to an early end. Though the Steelers' defense was as strong as ever, the Ravens' offense, especially their dismal running game, was an unmitigated disaster. The team's top running back, Kenneth Dixon, managed only 57 rushing yards and fumbled once, leaving Baltimore's already struggling offense in tatters. After the game, Ravens head coach